She is everywhere in the portraits, and the portraits all agree on her. The enormous hats that look architectural rather than decorative. Brooches arranged on her chest like the accumulated weight of dynasty itself. The rigid posture, jaw set at precisely the angle of a woman who has never not once doubted her right to occupy the space she is standing in. The eyes, dark and direct, aimed somewhere above the photographer's head, as if the camera were an inconvenience below her attention. British public liked this image because it was consistent. She was born in 1867 and she died in 1953, and across those 85 years, presented the same face to the world: competent, correct, immovable. Empires fell during her lifetime. Russia lost its Tsar, her relative, seller in Ekaterinburg in 1918. The First World War took half the young men from a generation and rearranged the map of Europe so thoroughly. Continent she had grown up in barely resembled what it became. The Second World War killed 60 million people and ended the Age of Empire in slow, irreversible stages. Through all of it, Queen Mary remained Queen Mary. Hat on, brooches gleaming, posture correct. Obituaries in March 1953 used the word pillar. They called her a cornerstone of the institution and a guardian of tradition, and a woman whose long service had been the steadying force the monarchy needed across a century of change. These were not lies. They were portraits rather than people, which is another way of saying they were selected truths. Less selected version begins with something that the obituary writers found it gracious to skip over. Queen Mary could be cruel, not with anger, with volume, not with any of the methods that betray their motive by their noise. She was cruel in the way that only the very controlled can be. Patience and precision, and the particular devastation of a silence maintained for 20 years without a single visible crack in the cheerfulness. She denied her eldest son the right to introduce his wife to his family for the remainder of her lifetime. She watched her second son carry a burden that broke him before 60. She kept her fifth son in a cottage, separate from the main household, and recorded his death at 13 as a relief. She collected objects from houses where she was a guest and wrote her initials on the catalogues. She arrived at her niece's house during the Blitz with 55 servants and stripped the ivory from the walls. This is the story of the woman who did those things, the story of how she became that person, what it cost the people around her, and what she herself appears to have felt about any of it, which was, by every surviving account, very little she felt necessary to revise. You are at the beginning of a story that is stranger and more specific than the obituaries ever suggested. If you want to follow it all the way through, subscribe now and tap the bell icon. We release new royal history every week. Story has a long way still to go. To start at the beginning is to start with money, or rather, specific shape of distress that develops in a family that has rank without the income to support it. That shape, most childhood formations, does not declare itself. It works quietly over years into the bone. Princess Victoria Mary of Teck, called May by everyone who knew her, was born on May 26, 1867 at Kensington Palace, London. The birth address sounds grand, and it was meant to. Palace at that time was a building divided into apartments of varying quality, and the Teck family's apartment, though respectable, was a long way from the rooms where sovereign monarchs had been born. The coincidence that May arrived in the same chamber where Queen Victoria had born 48 years and 2 days earlier was noted and preserved, because royal families preserve these details with a care that says something about their relationship with continuity and legitimacy. Rome had produced one queen. The implication was that it might produce another. It was premature, and it was also eventually correct. Christening assembled an impressive godparental list. Queen Victoria herself stood as godparent. The Prince of Wales, who would one day become King Edward VII, was another. The infant was given a name that could barely fit on a calling card without requiring second line: Princess Victoria Mary Augusta Louise Olga Pauline Claudine Agnes of Teck. Everyone called her May, and the name suited the month of her birth, and the simplicity of it was a small deception. Nothing about her situation was simple. Her mother was Princess Mary Adelaide of Cambridge, a granddaughter of King George III, woman of considerable warmth, enormous sociability, a genuine talent for charitable work, and a relationship with money that can only be described as serene, in the way that true recklessness can appear serene from the outside. Did not gamble away estates or maintain secret debts in the manner of the more dramatic ruined aristocrats. What she did was simply spend. She entertained on a scale that her income did not support. She hosted dinners for people who could afford to be generous. She dressed with the expense expected of a princess and was surprised each time the bills arrived. find them larger than the occasion had felt in the living. Her father was Francis, Duke of Teck, a prince of the Württemberg house, or more precisely a prince attached to the Württemberg line through descent from a morganatic marriage, meaning a marriage that was socially acceptable but legally reduced in terms of what it passed on. Francis had royal blood and the title that came with it, a name that announced itself impressively in any room he entered, income that fell short of supporting the announcement. He was charming, he was handsome, he was excellent company, chronically unable to make his finances work. He borrowed, he deferred, he accepted the hospitality of others with the ease of a man who considers being well received as a form of reciprocity. Household the two of them built was a specific kind of fiction, a royal household that looked like one should and functioned, below the surface, constant low-grade anxiety of a family that knows it cannot actually pay for everything it is doing. Lived at Kensington Palace and at White Lodge in Richmond Park, which Queen Victoria allowed them to use. The White Lodge was lent, not owned, is a distinction that anyone managing a household learns to feel acutely, because a lent house is a house that can be taken back. Parliament provided Mary Adelaide with an annual allowance, a parliamentary grant for her upkeep as a royal princess. This was added whatever her mother contributed, and whatever her husband managed. None of it was enough. May was the eldest child and the only daughter. Her brothers Adolphus, Francis and Alexander came after her, were boys in the straightforward way of boys in Victorian aristocratic families, energetic, noisy, expected eventually to sort themselves out. The daughter absorbed differently. May watched the household, with the attention of someone who had figured out, earlier than she should have needed to, there was a gap between what the household performed and what it could sustain. She saw when invitations mattered and when they carried an edge. She saw the faint hesitation in certain people's expressions when the subject of her parents' finances arose in the way it always did. Eventually, in circles where everyone knew everyone's approximate circumstances, she noticed who outranked whom at dinner and what the gradations of precedence. In practical terms, she was the eldest child and the only daughter, meant she was also the one her mother brought along on charitable visits and social calls, placed beside Mary Adelaide in drawing rooms and hospital wards alike, watching her mother work a room with the unself-conscious ease of a woman who, being loved and assumed the love was mutual. It was largely, Mary Adelaide was popular, people liked her. She was the kind of royal who made other people feel visible, who remembered their names and asked after their children, and generally treated the experience of being in her company as something worth having. May learned from this, but she did not copy it. She saw it alongside the bills. She saw it alongside the borrowed house and the parliamentary allowance and the gentle but persistent reality that her mother's warmth was part of kept the household's social credit alive. That charm was a currency being spent in service of debt management. Kindness and the budget pressure were not separable. That kind of observation, sustained across childhood, produces a specific result, tends to produce either the complete rejection of money as a moral category, conclusion that stability is the most important thing a person can secure, and that securing it requires methods other than charm. Chose the second. Her education was managed at home by governesses, as was standard for daughters of her class. Her primary governess, Hélène Bricker, had real intellectual standards and the inclination to hold her pupil to them. May responded by becoming genuinely learned in a way that exceeded what most women of her background and period were expected to achieve. She studied history with the attention of someone who would eventually live inside it. She developed facility in languages, English, German, French, a working knowledge of several others. She read widely, not in the dilettante manner of someone covering respectable ground, but with the focus of a person who finds that knowledge is one of the few things in her situation that reliably exists. She also learned the practical curriculum of a royal princess, how to enter a room, how to conduct a conversation without revealing more than was appropriate, how to manage her expression in circumstances where expression needed managing, how to make the performance of composure look like the genuine article until the two became indistinguishable. Last skill she would practice for the next 80 years. There were also the objects. From early on, May had an eye for beautiful things in a specific way, not the simple pleasure of looking at something lovely, the more exacting attention of someone who wants to understand what an object is, where it comes from, presence says about the household it belongs to. She grew up in rooms where the furniture and the pictures and the small pieces on the LPs carried lineage in them. A miniature portrait of a dead ancestor was not merely decoration, evidence of continuing connection to people who had mattered. An old table was not merely functional, proof that a family had occupied a certain world for long enough to have old tables in it. She developed the habit, recorded in later accounts, stopping at market stalls where old buttons and broken cameos and faded fans lay in boxes, asking questions about provenance and material and history. She did not always buy. When she did, she chose the best available thing within whatever she had, and she kept it with a care that exceeded its apparent value. Her father encouraged this. He had some of the same impulse toward objects, though his financial situation meant the impulse was more often frustrated than satisfied. Came Florence. The Teck household's debts became, in the early 1880s, an immediate problem rather than a chronic one. Creditors who had been managing their patients through several years of polite deferral were no longer managing it. Family's position in London required a certain level of expenditure to maintain itself. Expenditure exceeded the income by a margin that had compounded into something serious. In 1883, when May was 16, the family left England, travelled under assumed names for part of the journey, calling themselves the Count and Countess of Hohenstein. Fiction lasted until Mary Adelaide wanted better service at a hotel, which point she reverted to the style and title that correctly described her. Nothing demonstrates the earnestness of one's humility like insisting on one's actual rank while avoiding one's actual creditors. Moved through Germany and Austria, staying with relatives and accepting the extended hospitality that royal families are equipped to extend to one another in moments of mutual necessity. They settled eventually in Florence, Italy, where life was beautiful and relatively cheap, where no one was actively waiting at the gate with a bill. For May, Florence was an education that no governess had arranged. She was 16 when she arrived and 19 when the family returned to England in 1885. 3 years in a city that had been collecting beautiful things since the Medici decided that art was a better use of Florentine money than modesty. She walked through the Uffizi and the Pitti Palace and the churches of the city, which were themselves museums of accumulated civilization. She saw what dynasties that lasted built, collections, objects in which their story was encoded for the people who came after. She absorbed this not as a lesson in aesthetics but as information about permanence. Exile by debt teaches a specific set of lessons. Teaches you that rank is not security. It teaches you that name alone is not a guarantee against being moved on by your circumstances. Teaches you that the gap between appearing to belong somewhere and actually belonging there is the gap where disaster tends to happen. Teaches you that if you ever get your hands on genuine, material, documented security, you do not release it, you catalog it, you mark it, defend it. She spent 3 years absorbing these lessons in the museums and drawing rooms and palaces of Florence. Visual language of power preserved in stone and paint and velvet was everywhere, where the connection between what you owned and who you were was expressed across every surface. Came back to England in 1885 knowing things that most girls her age and background had no occasion to know. She was, by every account available, noticeably more formidable person than she had been when she left, quieter than her mother, more contained, more difficult to surprise. She had been frightened into organization, and the organization had taken. Before Mary could be queen, she had to navigate a woman who had been queen first. Queen Alexandra, wife of Edward VII and daughter of the Danish royal house. By every account, one of the most beautiful women who had ever occupied the English throne, and she knew it. She used it with a precision that was entirely unconscious and therefore entirely unstoppable. Alexandra had been beautiful in her youth, and she was beautiful in her age, and the beauty had its own specific gravitational effect. Wherever she entered, people turned. Her popularity with the British public ran to adoration. She worked charitable causes with genuine engagement. She was warm with children in the way that makes children remember you. She was warm with her dogs, of which she kept too many. She was warm with her women friends. She was warm with her son Edward and her grandchildren in an intimate, cozy, indiscriminate way that filled rooms with the impression of tenderness. She was also the consistent assessment of the people who observed her in the long years of George and Mary's marriage, systematically unhelpful about the transition of authority. The problem was not malicious, which made it more difficult to address. Alexandra did not scheme against her daughter-in-law. She did not issue instructions designed to undermine Mary's management of the household. What she did was simply remain present, beloved, surrounded by her ladies, expecting deference, accustomed to attention. slow to acknowledge that the younger woman beside her had taken on the role that had once been hers. Edward VII died in May 1910 and George became king. Alexandra's status changed formally. She became Queen Mother, Dowager Queen, previous sovereign's widow. Mary became Queen Consort. The transition was clear on paper, it was less clear at Sandringham. Alexandra loved Sandringham in the way of a woman who had organized her life around a place and could not easily imagine that the place was not still organized around her. The furniture was where she had put it. The dogs knew her step. Staff she had trained for decades had habits formed to her preferences. She had been there since 1863 when she arrived as the new Princess of Wales, beautiful 20-year-old from Copenhagen, who had been brought to England to marry the heir, and whose entire subsequent life was built around this place and this family. She did not move quickly. The Dowager's residence at Marlborough House sat unused for years while Alexandra continued occupying her apartments at Sandringham, and periodically at Buckingham Palace. The occupation was entirely genteel. There was no confrontation. Were requests, suggestions, arrangements that did not quite complete. Alexandra lived at a pace that was her own. It was not the pace of a woman who understood herself to be in the way. Mary managed this with the discipline she brought to everything. She made no public statement about the situation. She wrote in her diary. She maintained the correct relations. She organized around the presence of her predecessor, with the patience of a woman who had learned in Florence that secure possession required methods other than confrontation. Alexandra eventually took up residence at Marlborough House, and in her later years at Sandringham House, George and Mary occupied mainly at Christmas and in the shooting season. The two women found an accommodation that was functional and correct. Alexandra died in November 1925, aged 80, at Sandringham, in the house that had been her life. She had been deaf since her 30s, partial deafness increasing with age until it constituted a significant isolation, and she had developed around it. People with sensory impairment often do, her own interior world that the people around her could join but not manage. Mary attended her funeral and went through the apartments afterward and noted quietly what would need to be rearranged. Collected accounts of the Alexandra years agree on one thing: Mary never complained about her predecessor in any form that was preserved and published. Whatever she felt about the long, gentle occupation of spaces that should by protocol have been hers, she organized into a patience that outlasted the occupation. She had been trained to be patient by circumstances that had required it since childhood. She applied the training here as she applied it everywhere. The relief, if she felt it, was also never recorded. She noted Alexandra's death and arranged for what needed to be arranged. She did not elaborate. She moved forward into the space that had been vacated and began the process of placing things correctly. Back in England, May entered the marriage market that existed for women of her rank. This was not a romantic system, though it was not without its occasional romantic moments. It was a system of negotiation and placement. Question was not primarily who one liked, but where one could be placed to best advantage. May had considerable advantages. Born in England, which mattered to Queen Victoria, she was well-read, well-connected through her mother's Cambridge blood, possessed of the kind of bearing and seriousness that older royal women found reassuring. She was not threatening. She was not the sort of woman whose glamour might distract a king from his responsibilities or cause the court to worry about her influence. She was sensible, she was prepared, she was in the language of the people arranging these things, suitable. First engagement came in December 1891. Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence, eldest son of the Prince of Wales and second in line to the throne, known in the family as Eddie. History has treated Albert Victor without much confidence, though partly because he died young enough that the full truth of his character could not be established. Was handsome in the way of a certain type of Victorian prince, softly decorative, golden-haired in photographs, a manner that could be interpreted as gentle or as vague, depending on the particular anxiety of the interpreter. He was the eldest son, and therefore the heir to the heir, which meant his position was assured in institutional terms even when his capabilities in other terms were less certain. His tutors had worried. His parents had worried. Particular kind of worry that attaches to a future king who may not be equipped for the role had followed him through his 20s. May accepted the engagement with the composure she brought to everything. Whether she felt anything personal toward Albert Victor, beyond the assessment of his suitability and the relief of her own position being settled, is something the historical record cannot confirm. She had been trained to manage her feelings as an institutional matter. The engagement was announced. The wedding was planned for February 1892. January 14, 1892, Albert Victor died. He had contracted influenza during the epidemic that was sweeping Britain that winter. Illness moved to his lungs. Within days it was clear he was seriously ill, and within days of that it was clear he was dying. On that Tuesday morning at Sandringham he died. He was 28, May was 24. Position was suddenly one without precedent or clear path. The mourning period was performed correctly. This is not a cruel statement. She may have grieved. The record does not contradict the possibility. But what is certain is that whatever she felt was organized and expressed inside the required form, and the required form in this situation was a sustained, visible, correct mourning from which the family's next practical requirement would eventually emerge. That requirement emerged within the year. Queen Victoria was a practical woman, whatever her reputation as a sentimental mourner might suggest. She was practical about this. Teck had been prepared, assessed, approved and positioned. She was exactly what the family needed in a royal consort. Loss of Albert Victor was a tragedy, but it was not, in the institutional calculus, reason to release his intended bride back into the open market. The better solution was to redirect. Prince George, the second son, become the heir to the heir when his brother died. George was 26, unmarried, now the most important young man in the British succession. His own preferences in the matter are recorded in his letters with a caution that suggests he was aware of how much weight his mother's wishes and his grandmother's preference would carry, framing himself as independently inclined in a direction his family approved was more diplomatic than admitting the arrangement was largely determined without him. He and May became acquainted over the following year, walked and talked and corresponded, and met in the formal way of people who both understood the encounter was supervised. Became engaged in May 1893, 16 months after the death of his brother. They married on July 6, 1893 at the Chapel Royal in St. Newspapers covered it as a love story of sorts, the romantic resolution of a sad tale. The crowds were large. Descriptions were enthusiastic. The bride wore white silk and lace, and carried herself, as everyone who was there agreed, exceptional composure. She was 26 years old. She had been engaged to one prince and watched him die. She was now married to his brother. She had accepted both with the same controlled precision. Whether she allowed herself to feel the strangeness of this privately, whatever hours she was genuinely alone, is not something any document addresses. She had learned by this point that feelings which served no productive purpose were most efficiently managed by not engaging with them. George was a different personality from his brother in nearly every measurable dimension. He was compact where Albert Victor was soft, direct where his brother had been oblique. He had a temper that he expressed in sharp, short corrections rather than extended anger. He had very strong opinions about correctness, propriety, and the proper way of doing things. He communicated those opinions with a frequency and precision that the people around him, including his children, found exhausting and sometimes frightening. He stamped his collection of postage stamps with the same focused seriousness he brought to governing an empire, which tells you something useful about his temperament. He was also capable of warmth. His letters to May from the early years of their marriage, and throughout the decades that followed, show a man who appreciated his wife specifically, pressed it with a directness he rarely managed in person. He noted her intelligence, he relied on her judgment. He appears to have genuinely respected her, in ways that he did not always demonstrate toward the people who worked for him. Gap between his private acknowledgement and his public manner was characteristic of the household he was constructing. Warmth existed in this family. It existed mainly in writing, and mainly between adults, mainly in situations where the institutional expectations had momentarily relaxed. May's adaptation to the role of Duchess of York, Princess of Wales, then Queen Consort, was the work of a woman who had been preparing for exactly this kind of position, since she understood what conditions were. She mastered the protocol with thoroughness. She learned the schedules, the obligations, the demands, order of precedence at every kind of event, the requirements of the households at York Cottage and Sandringham and Balmoral. She had opinions about furnishing an arrangement, and her opinions were correct in the historical sense. She could tell you who had owned a particular piece, when it had been acquired, what its provenance was, and whether it was correctly displayed. George, who shared her interest in order but expressed it differently, found this a reliable quality. They worked what they did not work at. the evidence consistently supports was parenting. Not because they were indifferent, because the household they were building together reflected the household that each of them had been built in, place where the correct performance was the primary currency, where the right clothes and the right posture and the right behavior at public events were what was tracked, and where the emotional interior of a child was a matter for the nursery and the governess, and eventually for the child itself. Sought out. The children began arriving in 1894. Edward, their eldest, born on June 23, 1894, was called David in the family from birth. Albert, December 14, 1895, was called Bertie. Princess Mary arrived in April 1897, Henry in March 1900, George in December 1902, and John, the last, in July 1905. The first nurse was hired for Edward and Albert and proved, over several years, to have been entirely the wrong person for the position. She was later described in accounts that emerged after the fact as in a state of emotional breakdown during much of her tenure, personally obsessed with Edward to a degree that was expressed in behavior that was inconsistent and destabilizing, simultaneously neglectful of Albert to a degree that left marks. Mary did not know about this for some years. The nurse had not told her. Nursery management system that Mary and George operated was not designed to surface difficulties of this kind, because the household ran on the principle that the people employed had the required competence to manage their assignments, and adults did not require supervision of their interior states. When she discovered the nurse's condition, she dismissed her. Discovery came because the nurse had a breakdown that was too visible to manage. The children had been in her care for 3 years. Consequences of those years were measurable. Bertie's stammer began around the time his parents returned from a 9-month tour of the Empire in November 1901. They had left for this tour when Bertie was 5 and returned when he was 6. He had not seen his parents except briefly for 9 months of his childhood. When they returned, the youngest children, including Henry, who had been born just before their departure and had no memory of them, cried when approached. Bertie, who was old enough to remember that his parents were his parents but young enough to have spent 9 months without them, stood when the moment required and greeted them as was expected. But the reunion, by the account preserved in various family biographies, awkward and formal and not the warm homecoming that anyone had scripted. Shortly afterward, Bertie's stammer emerged. It would remain with him for the rest of his life, severe enough in his youth to be a near incapacitating anxiety, managed over decades through effort that was private and painful, and eventually, through work with the speech therapist Lionel Logue in the late 1920s, made manageable if not fully resolved. The stammer responded to stress, which meant every public appearance, every speech, every moment when the weight of the institution pressed hardest was also a moment when his particular difficulty would push back. George V's approach to the stammer was not sympathetic. He believed in facing difficulties directly, which he meant that the correct response to a problem was to perform correctly in spite of it. A son who could not manage this was failing in his duty. His corrections of Bertie were noted in enough accounts by enough separate witnesses to be taken as reliable. He told him to pull himself together. He told him to make the effort. He told him that the stammer was something he could resolve if he chose to apply himself with sufficient seriousness. Assessment was wrong medically and wrong practically, and the evidence of its wrongness accumulated over years in Bertie's continued difficulty. Visible anxiety in his father's presence. May was present for some of these corrections. What she did in response is not documented in a way that suggests intervention on her son's behalf. Household standard of performance was the household standard. Exceptions had costs. She appears to have decided consistently the standard was the standard. Bertie was also made to wear metal splints on his legs to correct his knock-knees, practice of the period that was understood as medical correction and was experienced as sustained discomfort that coincided with his most anxious developmental years. He was naturally left-handed and required to write with his right hand, because left-handedness was considered, in the world his parents inhabited, a deficit that required correction rather than an individual characteristic that required accommodation. Corrections were applied with the same confidence with which the household applied all corrections, were done because they were considered right. The cumulative effect on Bertie was a boy, and then a man, was simultaneously more capable and more damaged than anyone in his family adequately acknowledged until decades later. He worked harder than his formation should have permitted. He developed through the sheer determination not to fail at what was required of him. Solidity of character that his early years had done nothing to build. He was in the assessment of people who knew him well in his adult life, one of the most genuinely decent men who occupied the English throne. He was also deeply fragile in ways that the throne's pressures relentlessly tacked. His mother is one of the reasons for both. Princess Mary, the only daughter, grew up inside the same system. She was warm, somewhat quieter than her brothers, and in the way of girls raised in households where women's primary function was to be good company. Good company. She liked horses. She was practical. She had a sense of humor that she deployed carefully because the household did not prize public humor in its women. When she was old enough to marry the family assessed candidates, the candidate settled upon was Henry Lascelles, Count Lascelles, who became the 6th Earl of Harewood. He was 15 years older than Princess Mary. He was wealthy. He was aristocratic, judged suitable in every institutional sense. Those who knew both parties and who wrote about the marriage afterward did not describe it as choice a woman would make freely. Lascelles was considered cold by people in his circle. He could be unkind. He was not the kind of man whose company a woman sought for its warmth. May appears to have known this in some degree. She wrote in her diary that she hoped the match would be a happy one. The sentence is the sentence of someone who is aware the hope may be optimistic, and has decided to proceed on the basis that happiness in marriage is possible under conditions of institutional suitability. Wedding was held in February 1922. The question of happiness in the Lascelles marriage is not the main story here. Main story is what the choice reveals about how Mary understood her daughter's prospects. She had accepted a match she was uncertain about. She had understood the necessity and had concluded that the necessity outweighed the uncertainty. She had then watched her daughter walk toward a man who would not be kind to her, in the understanding that kindness was not the primary factor in the arrangement. This logic, reproduced in her own life 3 decades earlier, when she had accepted her transfer from one dead man's brother to the next, had a particular self-replicating quality. May had been placed where she was placed, and had made it work through discipline and control. Understanding underneath this was that the institutional framework was the primary reality, and that personal feeling was manageable within it. She applied the same reasoning to her daughter, without appearing to notice that the daughter was a different person, with different capacities, in a different marriage with different options for management. Her second son, Bertie, defied this pattern through his marriage in 1923 to Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, which was a love match in a genuine sense and which his parents both approved precisely because Elizabeth had the qualities that May found admirable: self-possession, social competence, the ability to perform correctly in public circumstances, and the presence to hold a room. Elizabeth was also warm in ways that May could not replicate, that she was accessible to children and to distress and to the uncorrected human moment in a way that May had long since locked away from herself was perhaps not obvious to May at the time. Or perhaps it was obvious and she found it, as she found most qualities she did not herself possess. Slightly suspicious Henry, Duke of Gloucester, and George, the Duke of Kent, moved through the central narrative with less weight than their older brothers, partly because what is documented about them is less dramatic, and partly because the most dramatic elements of their lives are not central to the story of what their mother did. Henry was steady, competent, and largely overlooked by a family that measured itself against brilliance and found steadiness a lesser virtue. He remained loyal and correct in the way of people who have been formed to remain loyal and correct and who have absorbed lessons so completely that it becomes identical with their character. George was different. George, Duke of Kent, by the assessment of everyone who knew him, the most charismatic of the 6 siblings, the most gifted socially, most attractive in the straightforwardly physical sense. He was also the most troubled. His bisexuality, which was known within the family and managed within the framework of institutional silence that the household required, complicated his personal life in ways that the official record was not designed to accommodate. He had a serious and destabilizing relationship with a woman called Kiki Preston in the late 1920s and early 1930s that involved drug dependency and kind of spiral that families of any class recognize, and the family's response was to dispatch his eldest brother Edward to intervene. Edward did, and George was extracted from the relationship and appears to have recovered from the worst of it. His mother's response to George's particular difficulties is not documented in the historical record with the specificity that would allow confident assessment of her understanding or her feeling. What is documented is that she maintained the household's standard public presentation, and that the institutional silence worked as it was designed to work. George married Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark in November 1934. Marriage was considered by the family and the public successful. He died in August 1942, aged 39, in a wartime air crash in Scotland. Sunderland flying boat went down near Caithness on a journey toward Iceland. He had been one of 12 people on board. He's the only one identified as having died on impact. Mary attended his memorial service. She recorded her grief in the diary with precision and composure. She did not, in any document preserved and published, distinguish between the grief for the role and the grief for the person, because she had spent a lifetime not making that distinction, and this was not the occasion to start. And then there was John. John Charles Francis was born on July 12, 1905, at York Cottage on the Sandringham estate. He was the sixth and last child, born when his father was not yet king, and his eldest brother was 11, and his mother was 38, and the household was what it was. Christened on August 3, 1905. His godparents included his paternal grandfather, the Prince of Wales, who would become Edward VII, various other royals of the usual kind. By his fourth birthday it was clear that something was wrong in a way that the household needed to address. He was developing more slowly than his siblings. He had a first epileptic seizure at the age of 4. Over the following years, the seizures became more frequent and more severe. There were also other behavioral patterns, repetitive behaviors, difficulties with social interaction, signs that several later accounts described as consistent with what would now be diagnosed as autism. Framework for such a diagnosis did not exist in the first decade of the 20th century. In 1905, epilepsy was understood as a neurological condition, and it was also understood as something to be managed away from public view. Because the association between epilepsy and shame, between visible loss of control and family embarrassment, strong enough in the world George and May inhabited to constitute a practical concern. Family's handling of Prince John has been debated for a century, and the debate matters because it goes to the heart of what Mary was, parent and as a person. Some accounts, and the 2003 television drama called The Lost Prince is the most widely seen of these, frame the story as one of concealment and abandonment, of a child locked away because his condition was inconvenient and his presence complicated the public presentation the family required. Other accounts, drawing on the historical record more carefully, present a more nuanced and less damning version. What the record shows is John's nanny, Clara Cooper Bill, known to everyone as Lala, devoted to him with a love that was genuine and practical, and almost certainly more consistent than what his parents could provide. He appeared in official family photographs for most of his early childhood. He participated in family events at Sandringham, brought to the Christmas gathering in 1918, only weeks before his death, and drove back to Wood Farm that same evening. Local children were invited to Wood Farm to play with him at his mother's arrangement. It is also true that as his seizures worsened, as Lala wrote in private correspondence, that she dared not let him be with his brothers and sister because the attacks distressed them. World John lived in contracted to Wood Farm and its small household, and the public world came to know almost nothing about him. His existence was not secretly hidden from the beginning. His condition became impossible to manage in the main household. Family's solution was to create a household for him that was separate and was managed by the person who loved him most. That solution was the right one is a question that cannot be answered by the standards of 1915 or even by the standards of 2024 with complete confidence, because the alternatives available to a family in John's situation in Edwardian Britain were genuinely limited. There was no body of knowledge about childhood epilepsy and associated developmental conditions that would have permitted different decisions. Were no facilities of the kind that might now be considered. What there was Lala and Wood Farm. Whatever love could be managed in visits and arrangements, and decisions made from a distance. The distance itself is what troubles the record. Mary did not, by any account preserved, spend extensive time with John at Wood Farm. She visited, she arranged the visiting children. She managed from Buckingham Palace or Sandringham House the practical questions of his household. But the sustained, daily, present love that John received was from Lala, and the parents who loved him, in whatever way they were capable of loving him, did so mainly at a remove. His diary entry when John died on January 18, 1919, the entry that has been repeated most often in accounts of Queen Mary because it is the most legible evidence of how she experienced her children suffering. John had a severe seizure that evening at Wood Farm at 5:30 in the afternoon and died in his sleep. Lala telephoned Buckingham Palace. May and George drove to Wood Farm. Mary wrote in her diary that night that the news had come as a great shock. For the poor little boy's restless soul, death had come as a great relief. The sentence has been read for a century as evidence of coldness. People who found Mary cold found it confirmed. People who wanted to defend her found in it a mother's attempt to find consolation in a way available. Both readings are plausible. Neither is complete. What the sentence most clearly represents is the only way of handling grief that Mary had ever developed, finding the resolution in it, identifying the mercy in the loss, framing sorrow as something that could be organized into acceptance. She had been doing this since Florence. It was not callousness, it was the only instrument she had. John was buried on January 21, 1919 at St. Mary Magdalene Church at Sandringham. His grave is marked with a simple Celtic stone cross. The funeral, by the accounts of those who attended, full. People came to pay their respects to a boy whom many of them had known, and most of the country had not been told existed. Daily Mirror published his obituary, which was also the first public mention of his epilepsy. York Cottage, on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk, principal private residence of George and Mary for the early years of their marriage. It sounds, in retrospect, a reasonable country retreat, a cottage on the estate of a future king, suggesting modest comfort and rural ease. Reality was something that astonished nearly everyone who visited it with a view to understanding the family inside it. York Cottage was, the accounts of those who saw it regularly, an astonishingly small house for the number of people required to live inside it. Rooms were low-ceilinged, the spaces cramped, the arrangement such that a family with multiple children and the staff required to manage them was pressed together in conditions that produced inevitably friction of the kind that close proximity generates in people who are not given to pressing the friction openly. The children's rooms were modest even by ordinary middle-class standards of the period, let alone by the standards of what the children of the heir to the British throne might have expected. George chose York Cottage and preferred it. He was the kind of man who associated small and contained with manageable, found the grander spaces of Sandringham House, where his parents lived, too large and too full of social noise. He liked order. He liked to know what was where and who was doing what. York Cottage gave him a household he could see in its entirety. For the children, it meant a childhood that was managed in tight quarters, with parents who maintained formal standards of behavior, in rooms that barely accommodated people required to observe them. They ate together at meals that were conducted according to the rules their father applied to his household. Correct posture, correct address, correct silence when silence was required, which in practice meant when George was speaking or thinking. Father corrected them at table. Their mother maintained the standard. The staff watched. The children absorbed the lesson that the wrong word, the wrong movement, the wrong expression at the wrong moment had visible consequences. Edward later described his father in terms that suggested a man whose primary mode of engaging with the people around him was correction. Corrected because he believed in the standard. He believed in the standard because the standard was the thing he understood about how to be a father, in the same way that the standard was the thing he understood about how to be a king. The standard was clear, consistent, applied without mercy for exceptions. Mary participated in the standard by supporting it, which was not the same as creating it, was also not the same as opposing it. She had her own version of the standard, was less about explicit correction and more about expectation. The expectation that certain things would be done correctly, and that the children who failed to do them correctly would understand, through the quality of her attention rather than through explicit statement, they had fallen short. The combination of a father who corrected and a mother who expected produced children who were nervous in their parents' presence. This nervousness is documented in enough accounts to be treated as a reliable description, rather than the exaggeration of retrospective grievance. Courtiers who were present at family meals at Sandringham and later at Windsor described the children's behavior in the presence of both parents as constrained in a way that was painful to witness, careful where children of that age should have been relaxed, watchful where they should have been unself-conscious. George himself appears to have been aware of this effect, and to have considered it appropriate. Future king should not be entirely comfortable. Comfort bred complacency. Slight anxiety of a child in the presence of a father who maintained high standards was the appropriate condition of formation. He communicated this view to several of the courtiers around him. They noted it and said nothing that might have been useful. May's relationship with her mother-in-law, Queen Alexandra, who was Princess of Wales during the early years of the marriage and Queen during the decade of Edward VII's reign, was one of the more complex personal arrangements of her early years in the family. Alexandra, Danish-born Queen Consort, was by universal agreement one of the most beautiful women of her generation. Kind of beauty she possessed was the kind that also generates a particular species of protective blindness. She was loved so completely by the people around her that her less appealing qualities were managed with the care that was itself an expression of the love. She was also, by the accounts of those who worked closely with her and who wrote about it later, deeply possessive of her children. Possessive in the way that some mothers are, who have experienced a marriage in which love was not reliably returned, and who have therefore concentrated their emotional capital in their children, in a way that does not easily accommodate those children's departure, adult lives of their own. Her husband, Edward VII, had maintained a long and largely public career of extramarital associations. Alexandra had endured this with the grace that was expected of her and the pain that the grace was covering. George was her second son, after Albert Victor's death the most important to her. Her relationship with him, and therefore her relationship with his wife, shaped by this. She had transferred a significant portion of the emotional weight that her marriage had not adequately carried onto her surviving son. His marriage to May was something she accepted, partly because Queen Victoria had arranged and approved it, and partly because May was not the kind of woman who threatened Alexandra's position by attempting to compete with it. May had no interest in the competition. She had an interest in the role, and she managed that interest with a tact toward her mother-in-law that was consistent and careful. Relationship was correct rather than warm. Alexandra was charming, sentimental and emotionally available in ways that made May look. Comparison slightly removed, Alexandra's grandchildren, May and George's children, found their grandmother's warmth attractive precisely because it was a contrast to the register available at home. She would sweep them up and make a fuss of them and treat them as children rather than as dynastic assets. This endeared her to them and produced, as a consequence, the kind of comparison that a more insecure woman than May might have found difficult to manage. May managed it. She maintained correct relations with her mother-in-law for as long as Alexandra lived. It was until November 1925 when Alexandra died aged 80 at Sandringham. She had outlived her husband by 15 years. She had spent those 15 years at Sandringham, in the house that had been her family home, surrounded by the photographs and objects and domestic routines of the life she had lived there. She was in some ways the embodiment of what May had decided she would never be. A woman whose identity was entirely constructed around the people who loved her, rather than around the role she occupied. When the people went, the identity went with them. The only reigning British monarchs to travel to India for a durbar were George V and Queen Mary. Other such ceremony, the formal presentation of the imperial sovereign to the subjects of the Raj, had been conducted by proxy or in absentia, crown represented by a viceroy, the sovereign's physical presence implied by the pageant, rather than supplied by the person. George decided the 1911 Durbar would be different. He would go himself. Mary would accompany him. This decision, which was celebrated by the government and by the newspapers as an act of imperial confidence, was also a calculated risk. The journey was long, logistics were enormous, and taking the king out of England for several months during the first year of his reign was not without consequences for political management of the country. But the statement value was significant. King who went himself was a king who took the empire seriously as a personal commitment rather than an institutional inheritance. Sailed from Portsmouth on November 11, 1911, aboard HMS Medina. The voyage took several weeks. Mary observed the preparations with the methodical attention she gave to everything institutional. She understood that the Durbar was not merely ceremony, it was the most explicit visualization of what the empire claimed to be. Structure of authority and loyalty, in which the sovereign at the center was genuinely sovereign over the whole. Durbar required that visualization to be perfect, because a visualization that was imperfect would contain within it the acknowledgement that the claim was imperfect. He arrived in Bombay on December 2, 1911. What the city presented to the royal visitors was a full deployment of colonial Staging, the triumphal arches, the lines of schoolchildren, the military display, the municipal dignitaries in their formal dress, compressed visual argument that British India was capable of the most elaborate order. Mary received this with the express reception of a woman who understood spectacle as professional context and was not distracted by it. She made notes about what she saw, and what was presented to her, and what was correct and what was less so. Durbar itself was held at Delhi on December 12, 1911. 101,000 people had gathered. That is not an embellished figure. It was recorded at the time by the people responsible for managing the assembly. 101,000 people, in a purpose-built amphitheatre on the Delhi plain, in the winter morning light, arranged by rank and by allegiance and by the proximity of their loyalty to the centre of the occasion. George and Mary arrived at the amphitheatre in procession. They wore imperial regalia of a weight and a splendour that had been specifically manufactured for the occasion, since the crown jewels could not be removed from England. Mary wore a crown made of diamonds and other stones set in platinum, designed in London, worn for the first and last time at this ceremony and never worn again. She also wore the Cullinan diamond brooch, the Star of Africa, piece of such extraordinary size and quality that it constituted its own argument about the scale of what the empire had access to. George wore the imperial crown of India, also made for the occasion. They processed to a dais above the assembled representatives of the empire. Maharajas were ranged in sequence of precedence, each of them rich in the specific ways that the Indian princely states had concentrated wealth over centuries, and each of them there, as evidence of loyalty that was offered in exchange for the maintenance of their positions within the imperial structure. They had come from across the subcontinent to acknowledge the king-emperor and his consort. The acknowledgement was real, in the sense that it was present and performed and visible. What it meant to the people performing it was a different question, one that the Durbar's staging was not designed to accommodate. Mary received the gifts with the attentiveness that beautiful objects always produced. Her the Maharajas gave, and they gave with the generosity of men for whom giving at this scale was also an argument about their own significance. Necklaces of emeralds and pearls, pieces of Indian craftsmanship of the highest order, set with stones from the mines of states that the givers governed. Jewels that carried with them the history of the places they had come from, and the circumstances under which those places had come to be part of the system that had brought the Queen to Delhi to receive them. She catalogued. She noted. She understood what she was receiving not only as beautiful objects but as materials in the ongoing construction of the collection that, for her, the physical record of the institution's history. Indian jewels in the royal collection were the empire's gifts made material and preserved. They were evidence. She was collecting evidence of what the institution had been and what it had commanded. She wore the Delhi crown once. She wore the Indian jewels at the great state occasions of the following decades, and in the photographs from those occasions they are visible in their weight and their statement. Stones that were given on the plain outside Delhi in December 1911, still present on the Queen's person 30 years later as the empire they had commemorated progressively contracted. The Durbar photographs show her on the dais, correct posture, chin level, eyes at the angle she always maintained, focused slightly above the camera, as if the camera were a person of lesser consequence than the occasion required. She looks exactly as she looked in every photograph taken before and after this one. The empire was the context. She was performing within it. Performance was correct. Now we arrive at the collecting, which is both a smaller story than the one about her children, and in some ways a more legible one, because the objects she accumulated do not have the complicating dimension of love and its failures. The objects are simply there, catalogues and inventories marked with her initials, and the methods by which they arrived are documented with a frankness that the personal record never quite achieves. Queen Mary's interest in the royal collection was real and was extensive. She was, by any fair assessment, genuinely learned about the objects she pursued. She knew furniture history with the precision of a working curator. She knew provenance and attribution and period, with the focus of someone who had been developing her knowledge since childhood. Market stalls, and the galleries of Florence, and the accumulated decades of living inside houses, filled with things that carried history in them. When she identified a piece that she believed had been part of the royal collection and had wandered into private ownership, she often had a historically coherent argument for why it should return. The problem was the method by which she made her case. The standard account, circulating in drawing rooms for the better part of 50 years before and after her death was this: she came to a house, admired an object. The host understood, through the accumulated social intelligence of the British aristocracy, admiration from Queen Mary had a specific practical implication. The object left with her, it was transported in the royal car, added to the collection with her initials on the catalogue. Antique dealers locked their back rooms when they heard the royal car was approaching. This detail appears in enough separate accounts from enough separate sources to be accepted as a genuine practice rather than an embellishment. People who owned beautiful things and were expecting a visit from the Queen had a problem, because the Queen's visit created a social dynamic in which the host's ownership of their own possessions was placed in a kind of polite but functional suspension. The Angelica Kaufmann chairs story is the most widely repeated of the individual episodes. Mary was having tea with Lady Hudson, an elderly woman whose house contained a set of chairs painted by the 18th century Swiss artist Angelica Kaufmann. Mary admired the chairs. She noted with the precision that made her admiration so effective as a method, the chairs would go excellently with a Kaufmann table that she herself happened to own. The sentence was framed as observation. Function was something closer to arrangement. Lady Hudson understood. The chairs departed in the royal car. Method worked because of the social position of the two parties in any transaction of this kind. The Queen admired something. Host could agree that it would make a fine addition to the collection, which was the national interest. Host could decline to give the object, which required the host to do something that no one in British aristocratic society in the first half 20th century did easily. Tell the Queen no. Not many people did. Ones who managed it are remembered in anecdotes that record their nerve with something approaching admiration. Mary wrote letters, was the other method. She identified objects she believed had once belonged to royal households and wrote to the current owners explaining the historical case for their return to the collection. The letters were framed as requests. They functioned, given who was writing them, something between request and instruction. Recipients who had no interest in publicly declining a royal request tended to comply. Historian and writer Francis Donaldson, whose biography of Edward VIII remains one of the more careful assessments of the family from this period, noted with some dryness that the Queen's method of acquiring objects was considered, by those who had experienced it, form of social coercion that was entirely effective and entirely indefensible by anyone who wished to avoid publicly questioning the Queen's conduct. The Queen, for her part, would have described it differently. She was restoring objects to their proper place. She was serving the institution by preserving its material history. The fact that other people's feelings about their possessions were a casualty of service was regrettable but not central. What is interesting about the collecting, when you look at it alongside the rest of her character, is how consistent it is. She identified what should exist in a particular place, determined that it did not exist there, and arranged for it to be there. She applied this method to objects. She applied a version of it to people and to family dynamics. She had decided, from very early in her life, what the correct arrangement was, and she spent decades maintaining and restoring the arrangement against any departure from it. The obverse of this was her response when the arrangement was disturbed beyond her capacity to restore it, when the disturbance was too large or too personal to be catalogued and corrected. Thing that had gone wrong was a person. She could not simply mark with her initials and transport to where she needed them to be. George V died on January 20th, 1936 at Sandringham. The nature of his death was not fully public knowledge for decades. His physician, Dawson of Penn, was present at his bedside as the king's condition deteriorated on the evening of January 20. Dawson's diary, public after his own death, records that he administered a fatal injection of cocaine and morphine to the king that evening. The awareness that the king was dying, and the assessment that a swift, dignified death was preferable to an extended, undignified one. Timing was also influenced by the practical matter of morning newspaper deadlines. King's death announced in the morning papers of record was considered preferable to a death announced in the lesser evening editions. Mary was at the bedside when George died. She had been with him for 43 years. Whatever the private reality of that marriage, however much of it had been conducted through the mutual performance of institutional duty, rather than through the warmer emotional exchange that more openly affectionate couples managed, she had spent those years alongside this man. Record suggests she was genuinely bereft when he was gone. She moved correctly through the days that followed, the lying in state, funeral procession, the burial at Windsor. She moved from Buckingham Palace to Marlborough House, as was correct for a dowager queen. She left without the collection of objects she had accumulated at the palace, as protocol required. Those were the king's objects. King was now Edward VIII, and the palace was his. She took what was hers. She left what was the crown's. She made the distinction with the precision that had characterized all her dealings with the collection. Then she watched her son start to dismantle everything she had spent her life building. The story of Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson is told so often in so many forms. The full account here would be a repetition of material most people who are watching this documentary have already absorbed. What is less often told, because it requires a sustained attention to what Queen Mary was doing, rather than what her son was doing. Story of this particular mother watching this particular crisis unfold. She had known about Wallis Simpson since at least 1934, when it became impossible to know the Prince of Wales's social circle without knowing who held the primary position in it. She had met Wallis twice in social contexts. She had disliked her, or more precisely, she had assessed her and found her failing the assessment by all relevant criteria: American, divorced, not beautiful, not young, possessed of any quality that justified the Prince of Wales's attention, except the one quality that Mary was constitutionally unable to acknowledge in another person: the ability to withhold warmth in a way that made the person it was withheld from desperate for it. Observation that Edward was drawn to women who managed access to their affection in a controlled and somewhat withholding way was not Mary's observation. It was made later by biographers and psychologists, and the general project of retrospective analysis that the 20th century applied to British royal family. But the pattern is there in the record, starting from Fred Dudley Ward in 1918, and running through Thelma Furness and arriving at Wallis, and at each point the woman in question had a specific quality in common. She was not fully available. Always a condition. There was always a controlled distance that kept Edward reaching towards something he could never quite secure. Mary had given him exactly this in childhood. She was his mother and she loved him in whatever way she understood love. Her love was conditional on his performing correctly, and the performance of correct behavior in her household was a standard that shifted as dictated, so that Edward was perpetually uncertain of what was required and perpetually anxious about whether he was meeting it. He had been reaching toward her since childhood, and finding her managed at the precise distance that kept him reaching. He found in Wallis something that felt like the dynamic resolved. He was wrong, but the feeling was real. George V became king in May 1910. Following the death of Edward VII, May became queen. The coronation took place at Westminster Abbey on June 22, 1911. In a ceremony that May had prepared for, with the thoroughness she brought to everything she was required to perform. She looked exactly as a queen should look. The photographs from the ceremony show a woman of 44, who has arrived at the role she was prepared 20 years before, and who is wearing it with complete conviction. In December 1911 came the Delhi Durbar, great ceremony of imperial proclamation in India, at which the king and queen were presented to the subcontinent in their capacity as emperor and Empress of India. It was the first Durbar to be attended by a reigning British sovereign. George and Mary sailed to India in November and arrived to the spectacle of an imperial celebration, organized on a scale that only empires of a certain confidence and a certain willingness to use other people's territory for their ceremonies could manage. For May, India was a version of the lesson she had first learned in Florence, but larger. Maharajas received them with the extravagance of men for whom generosity was both genuine custom and strategic self-presentation. Jewels were given as gifts. Mary received them, assessed them, catalogued them, and noted them in the expanding archive of the collection. Durbar was also the moment that established in the visual language of the period exactly what the new British monarchy was. Institution so confident in its own continuity that it could install itself at the center of a civilization it did not understand and call the ceremony tribute. May understood the visual language perfectly. She dressed for it. She carried herself for it. She was the queen in every frame of the available photographs. The First World War began on August 4, 1914. George and Mary learned of it in the way that kings and queens learn of wars, through the formal channels that translate catastrophe into official notification. Mary's response to the war was practical in the way that she was practical about everything she organized. She organized the household at Buckingham Palace for wartime conditions. She reduced the royal household's food expenditure and publicized the reduction. She organized women's work programs. She visited hospitals and workshops and training facilities with a frequency and regularity that maintained the visibility of the crown in circumstances where the crown's position required very careful management. She also managed George. This is not a diminishing observation. George was not by any account available, a man who was easy to manage through a war in which his country was fighting, and in which his extended family on the German side were fighting on the other side. The complexity of the royal family's German connections was significant. First cousin Wilhelm was the German Kaiser. His wife's family, the Tecks, were German. House name of the British royal family was still Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, which was a German name. The public awareness of these connections grew as the war extended and casualties mounted, produced a pressure that George and Mary were required to manage together. Decision to change the family name was made in 1917. Windsor was chosen. George also encouraged his German-named relatives, who were resident in Britain, to adopt English names. The Battenbergs became the Mountbattens. Tecks became the Cambridges. The change was more than cosmetic. It was an assertion that the institution was British, primarily and permanently British, in circumstances where that assertion required active demonstration rather than assumption. Ported this change and extended it to the names of her own family. Her surviving brothers, who carried the Teck name, became Cambridge. She was no longer Princess May of Teck. She had not been that for 2 decades. The erasure of the Teck name from the family's formal British identity was also, in some personal sense, completion of the distancing she had begun when she left Florence. She had been formed by the Teck household and had spent her adult life building something stronger than what the Teck household had been. The name change was the last instrument in that project. 4 years of the First World War produced in May the public figure that the second half of her life would build upon. She was the steady, correct, never flinching queen who visited the wounded and attended the memorials and received the news of deaths, including the deaths of relatives in Germany, with the composure that the role required. Composure was real in the sense that she had practiced it for 40 years and had achieved a genuine merger between performance and character. She did not feel herself performing it because it had become what she was. What she did with the private reality of those 4 years, whatever she felt watching a generation of young men die in Belgium and France, is not available from the record in the direct way. She expressed appropriate sorrow. She expressed appropriate support for the war effort and for the institution of the monarchy as the symbol of national continuity. What she felt underneath the appropriate expression was managed inside the structure that she had built to manage it and was not in any form that the historical record preserves. George was harder to manage than she was. He visited the front in France several times and found the experience genuinely moving in ways that complicated the performance of royal steadiness. He fell from his horse during a review of troops in France in October 1915 and broke his pelvis, injury that caused him pain for the rest of his life. His diary entries from the war years show a man whose formality of expression was a casing around something more disturbed. He was not indifferent to what was happening. He was simply like his wife, trained to a form of response that did not allow for direct expression of the disturbance. Between them, maintained the public face of the monarchy through 4 years of the most destructive war Europe had seen. The institution survived. It was not nothing. In the summer of 1917, the German bombers over London dropped the last useful fiction about the British royal family's nationality. The Gotha bombers that struck London on June 13, 1917, killing 162 people in a single raid, named for the city in whose ducal house the British royal family's male line had originated. King of England was descended directly from the Saxe-Coburg-Gotha dynasty, which had produced both Prince Albert and his royal descendants. George V included. His family's name was German in origin, and German in the specific way that in 1917 was maximally inconvenient. German from Gotha, of all places, who was George's first cousin, and who was also his adversary in a war that had been consuming the young men of both their countries for 3 years. Reportedly commented that he was looking forward to a performance of The Merry Wives of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, a remark intended to illustrate what he considered the absurdity of the English royal family's position. Remark was not inaccurate in its underlying observation, whatever its intent. George responded by royal proclamation on July 7, 1917. Family would henceforth be known as the House of Windsor. All German titles held by British royals were renounced. German relatives living in England were requested to adopt anglicised surnames. Prince Louis of Battenberg had served as First Sea Lord at the outbreak of the war and been forced out of the position by anti-German public pressure in 1914. Came Lord Louis Mountbatten. The Tecks, which was Mary's family line, became the Cambridges. Various lesser branches made similar adjustments. Mary managed this transition with the institutional efficiency she brought to any administrative reorganization involving the family's public presentation. She had been born Princess Victoria Mary of Teck. The name Teck was her father's house. She had never been fully comfortable with the German associations, having spent her life navigating the gap between her family's royal blood and inability to fully inhabit the social position it implied. The renunciation of German titles was, in this specific way, not merely a political necessity but a kind of relief. She was British, she had always been British. Name change formalized what she had always understood herself to be. She organized the household's response to the change, with the thoroughness she brought to all organizational questions. Correspondence was updated. The social titles were adjusted in the appropriate official documents. Extended family was informed and their compliance managed. She did all of this without complaint and with the particular satisfaction, never quite expressed, of a woman who had spent 30 years performing complete Britishness and was now officially recording that performance in the definitive institutional register available. George's own response to the war was complicated in the way that complicated positions tend to be. Person is required to be the visible face of a national effort, while also managing private relationships that the national effort had rendered problematic. His German cousins, the Kaiser included, had been the people he saw at the family gatherings that European royal families convened at margins of ordinary politics. They had corresponded, they had met at weddings and funerals. The war made enemies of them. And the management of that transformation from cousin to adversary was something he navigated without the capacity for public acknowledgement of its personal cost. Mary's German connections were equally extensive and equally required of her that they be managed away from public view. Father had been a prince of the House of Württemberg. Her brothers had German titles. Various family members were on the other side of the war, in the sense that they were subjects of the German imperial state. She managed this privately and never discussed it publicly. She was the Queen of England. War required the Queen of England to be British without qualification, and she was. The 1917 renunciation, considered in retrospect one of the most successful institutional decisions of the 20th century. It removed a vulnerability that had been accumulating for 50 years since Prince Albert's death. It did so cleanly and completely, and with a rebranding efficiency that even the most critical accounts of the family have had to acknowledge. House of Windsor was a fiction in the sense that all institutional names are fictions, but it was a fiction that worked. It is the standard by which Mary judged these things. The nature of King George V's death on January 20, 1936, not established in full public knowledge until 1986, when the historian Francis Watson published an analysis of Lord Dawson of Penn's diary, had been made available to researchers at the Royal College of Physicians. The diary's entry for January 20, 1936, recorded that Dawson had administered an injection of 3/4 of a grain of morphia, followed by 1 gram of cocaine to the king at 11:15 in the evening, in the knowledge that the king was dying, and with the assessment that a swift, dignified death was preferable to the prolonged, undignified process that natural decline was producing. Diary also noted that Dawson had timed the injection with some awareness of the morning newspaper deadlines. The death announcement would appear in the morning editions of the major papers rather than in the lesser evening editions. Publication of this information in 1986 produced a range of responses, some who found in it confirmation of the mercy that the decision represented, given the medical reality of the king's condition. Some who found in it evidence of a practice that, had it been conducted on anyone less exalted, would have been considered criminal. And a much smaller number who addressed the question of what Mary knew or was told on the night. Published accounts do not resolve this question with certainty. Dawson's diary does not record Mary's awareness of his intentions. Dawson was a physician of the old school, accustomed to making decisions with the authority that the medical culture of his period invested in the physician's judgment, and the decision was made with the confidence of a man who considered it his to make. Whether he told Mary what he was going to do is not in the available record. Record does show is that Mary was at George's bedside when he died, and that she had been with him through the last days of his illness. The death when it came was, in whatever form the preparation or its absence had taken, not a surprise in the sense that deaths at the end of long illnesses can sometimes be surprises. She had known he was dying. She had managed the household through his decline. She had been, in the way she managed everything, organized and prepared and correct in her presence at the deathbed. After his death, the practical arrangements were immediate and extensive. King had died. A new king had to be proclaimed. The lying in state had to be organized. The funeral had to be arranged. Transition of the household from one king's reign to the next had to be managed. Mary participated in all of this with the efficiency of a woman who had been organizing royal events for 40 years and who, ever she was feeling about the death of the man she had lived beside for those 40 years, not going to allow the feeling to impede the correct management of what needed to be done. She moved to Marlborough House as required by protocol. She left Buckingham Palace. She took what was hers. She left what was the Crown's. She made this transition with a precision that was impressive, and with the same quality she brought to every transition in her life. Absolute clarity about what was required, absolute performance of the requirement. Ever personal reality lay underneath, expressed in the privacy of her diary and nowhere else. Diary entries from January and February 1936 are among the most quoted things she ever wrote, because they are among the rare occasions when the controlled language she used for everything came close to revealing something underneath it. She wrote of George, "He is gone," the 3 words. She wrote that the sadness was great. She wrote that she missed him. Missing is specific and recorded in a way that suggests she meant it. She had been with him for 43 years. She had performed the role of wife alongside his performance of the role of king with a consistency that was genuinely remarkable. Whether she had loved him in the way that the word love is sometimes deployed, the easy way, the way of warmth and accessibility, question for his letters and hers to answer. They answer it. In the correspondence that has been published and quoted, the impression of 2 people who respected each other and relied on each other and expressed their regard for each other in the only ways their respective formations permitted. She missed him. He had been the structure inside which her own structure had been housed, and the structure was gone. Period between the 2 wars, the 17 years from 1918 to 1936, is the period in which everything that would eventually destroy the public management of Queen Mary's family was quietly developing. It developed at the intersection of a rapidly changing country and a household that was constitutionally incapable of changing with it. Britain in the 1920s was not the Britain of the 1910s. Difference was not merely the arithmetic of the war dead, the million men who had not returned, and the million more who had returned damaged, in ways that took years to become fully visible. The difference was also political and social and generational, in a way that translated directly into changed attitude toward authority. The deference that had sustained the Victorian and Edwardian social structure, deference that required a certain kind of unexamined respect for institutions simply because they were institutions, was not what it had been. Men who had fought through 4 years of industrial slaughter under the command of generals they had learned not to trust, had come home with a different relationship to authority than the one they had left with. Their children were different again. Edward, the Prince of Wales, the most visible expression of what the new generation looked like from inside the royal family. He was young, charming in the modern manner, informal, accessible, capable of wearing a suit rather than a uniform without looking out of his depth. Talked to ordinary people with a genuine ease that his father, who was incapable of informality even when attempting it, could not replicate. Press adored him. The public adored him. The heir to the throne was a man who seemed to understand his time. His mother watched this with the specific attention of a woman who recognized the adoration and did not fully trust what was underneath it. She understood the appeal because she understood performance. She could see that her son was performing. What she was less certain of, what became less certain as the years passed, was whether there was sufficient structural substance under the performance to support the role. The role became the primary reality rather than the occasional occasion. George was more direct about it. He thought his son was deficient in ways that he expressed without diplomatic softening, in his presence and in private. The assessments that had been filtering into the court's awareness for years were consistent. The Prince of Wales was popular. Popularity was not the same as preparation, and George did not believe his eldest son was adequately prepared. Queen Alexandra died in 1925. Family was reorganized around her absence in the manner of all families when an older generation removes itself. Mary took up what had been Alexandra's position in the household with a care and a precision that observers found impressive. Sandringham household, which had been managed around Alexandra's presence and preferences for decades, was reorganized. The objects were moved. Domestic life of the royal household was adjusted to reflect the new authority at its center. In 1928, George was seriously ill. He had a thoracic infection that became severe enough that his doctors were, by the account of several of them, genuinely uncertain whether he would survive. He was taken to Bognor Regis to recover. Recovery was slow and incomplete, in the sense that he was never quite the same afterward, illness having begun the long process of physical decline that would end at Sandringham in January 1936. Mary organized the household around the illness with the practicality she brought to every practical problem. She managed the visitors, doctors' schedules, the public communications. She maintained the public appearances as long as she could, and when she could not, she managed the communication about their absence. She also watched her son continue to do what he was doing. Edward's social life in the late 1920s and early 1930s was the social life of a man who had organized himself around the pleasure of not being what position required, the parties, the women, the Fort Belvedere weekend gatherings where the Prince of Wales could be casually modern in a way that Buckingham Palace and Windsor did not permit. His clothes, his friends, his ability to sit on a table at a nightclub and have the room understand the heir to the throne was choosing them tonight, and that the choice conferred something. Mary attended the public events. She performed the public role. She read the intelligence that courtiers and family members and friends provided about what her son was doing. She organized what she could, and she watched what she could not organize move toward the place it was moving. In September 1936, George V died. The Prince of Wales became king. He had been king for fewer than 12 months when he abdicated. British newspapers of the first half of the 20th century operated under a set of understandings about the monarchy that are now effectively unimaginable. Understanding was not legally codified. It was social, which meant it was more reliable than law, because it was held in place by the mutual interest of all parties involved: the editors who wanted access, courtiers who wanted favorable coverage, and the advertisers who wanted a stable political context for their business. System was self-reinforcing, and it worked for 60 years with a thoroughness that historians have spent the decades since attempting to account. Queen Mary benefited from this system more than almost anyone in the institution, because she was precisely the kind of figure that the system was designed to produce: an image rather than a person, a symbol rather than a subject, representation of something larger than herself, that the newspapers could address as such, without any obligation to look behind the representation, the woman it was built on. The image the newspapers produced was consistent. The Illustrated London News covered royal events in the illustrated press, ran photographs of Mary at public events, inspecting hospitals, attending garden parties, visiting exhibitions, presiding over civic occasions, presenting herself at the required ceremonies with the composure that the system required. Captions described a woman of dignity and dedication. The prose in the surrounding text, when it existed, maintained the same register: Queen's gracious presence, the Queen's evident interest, the Queen's steadfast service. Queen was always gracious and always steady and always correct. The content that did not appear in the newspapers was extensive. Collecting method, the coercive admiration, the antique dealers and the Angelica Kaufmann chairs, not in print. Management of her son's stammer through corrections that compounded rather than resolved it, not in print. Nurse who had been in breakdown for 3 years while managing the Royal Children's Nursery, not in print. Prince John's existence, fully in print until the Daily Mirror obituary in January 1919, by which point the question was not whether to publish, but whether to write it correctly. The full nature of George V's death, not in any newspaper until 1986, when Lord Dawson's diary became available to researchers. Public image of Queen Mary was therefore a substantial work of collective management, attained not primarily by any deliberate censorship mechanism, but by the voluntary participation of a press that had concluded, through decades of practice, that the maintenance of the image was in everyone's interest, including theirs. Mary understood this system in the way that people who have lived inside it from birth understand systems, not by analysis but by instinct. the accumulated knowledge of what happens when things work and what happens when they don't. She managed her public presentations with the awareness that the presentation was a form of protection, not only for herself but for the institution that depended on its subjects' willingness to sustain the collective fiction of an exemplary family. She gave nothing that was not required, no unnecessary statements, no unauthorized photographs, no unmanaged access to her private life or to the private lives of her children, except the access that slipped through, as access always does, round the edges of people who find the management oppressive and speak to someone who writes it down. She was not paranoid about this. She did not need to be. The system managed itself. What happened when the system broke down? When something became too large to contain within the usual managing was the abdication. Abdication was the moment at which the managing failed because the king himself declined to participate in it. Edward understood the system from the inside as well as his mother did. He had been performing within it since childhood. He chose not to perform, and the system which required his performance as its central act could not hold without it. The newspapers, which had maintained their silence on Mrs. Simpson's existence for months, while American and continental papers ran the story in full, published once it was no longer possible not to. The readership that had been reading American papers and the letters of American friends now read the crisis in their own press. The image cracked. Inside the crack was the private reality that had been managed away for 40 years. Family that had sacrificed its warmth to its performance, and a man who had decided the sacrifice was no longer acceptable. Mary read the newspapers. She understood what had been broken and what that breaking would cost. Only her personally, but the system that had protected all of them, for as long as she could remember. Edward, the Prince of Wales from June 1910. 20 years old at his father's coronation, and entered the years between the wars as a public figure of unusual visibility and unusual popularity. He was charming in a way that his father was not, accessible in a way that the traditional royal manner made impossible, physically attractive in the style of the period, lean, athletic, golden-haired in photographs, a zest of what the press of the 1920s described as boyish appeal, in a way that made him seem perpetually the very best version of the English gentleman, at his most approachable. He also had a restlessness that was visible to anyone who spent time with him beyond the social surface. He was not satisfied by the public role. Found the ceremonial obligations stifling in a way that produced, in compensation, a private life that was its opposite, informal, American-influenced in its tastes, oriented toward jazz and cocktails and the kind of easy transatlantic social mixing that his parents found vulgar. He dressed in ways that alarmed the palace. He stayed out to hours that alarmed the palace. He maintained friendships with Americans and Australians and people of various classes in ways that his parents found inexplicable. George V's relationship with his eldest son deteriorated progressively through the 1920s and into the 30s. Letters George wrote to David on the subject of his behavior have been preserved and are not comfortable reading. They are specific, corrective, often harsh, and rarely balanced by anything that acknowledged David's competence or his genuine qualities. George wrote to David the way he had spoken to him at the York Cottage dinner table, from the position of someone whose authority was the primary thing, and whose expectations had been failed. He told him he was disappointing. He told him his personal life was a disgrace. He told him that the behavior was unacceptable. David received these letters, responded with a careful attempt to maintain his position without entirely capitulating, and continued doing what he was doing. May watched this deterioration from the position she had occupied her entire adult life, alongside George supporting his authority, maintaining the household standard, and making no intervention in the direction of either of the two men, whose relationship was becoming her largest, unaddressed problem. She wrote to David as well. Her letters are available in excerpted form, and their register is consistent with the rest of her correspondence, concerned in a formal sense, specific about duty and about what the role required, careful about personal system. She told him, in various formulations, that his behavior was causing his parents anxiety. She told him that the associations he was maintaining were inappropriate. She told him what was required of a future king. What the letters do not contain, in any excerpt that has been published, is an acknowledgement of the person David was, separate from the role he was failing. He was 40 years old in the mid-1930s, and his mother was still writing to him about the requirements of his position. Requirements were real. They were also not the only reality, and the consistent focus on them, to the exclusion of the human reality, pattern that the documentary record makes impossible to miss. The connection between the way David was approached in these years and the choices he subsequently made cannot be established with the certainty of cause and effect. People make their choices from a complex of factors that biographical distance can map but not fully explain. Can be said is that David was a man who had spent 40 years being told that his performance of a role was what mattered. The role required him to sacrifice his personal preference, and that the monarchy was the primary claim on his life. When he chose Wallis Simpson, he chose the one thing that the role could not accommodate. Whether that was coincidence or the predictable conclusion of what had been building for decades is a question each viewer of this documentary will answer according to their own understanding of human nature. If this documentary has given you something to think about, a like takes 2 seconds and it tells the algorithm there is an audience for this kind of detailed work. Leave a comment below. Has surprised you most so far? We read everyone. By the autumn of 1936, the situation had moved beyond the management of a private relationship into a constitutional crisis. The king intended to marry. The woman he intended to marry was in the process of divorcing her second husband. The Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, told the king in direct terms that the marriage was unacceptable. The church would not bless it. The dominions would not accept it. Government would not continue in office if the king proceeded. The dominions had been consulted. Their positions were consistent. Newspapers in Britain had maintained a careful silence while the American and continental press ran the story in full. Meant that a significant portion of the British public was discovering what was happening at the same time as it was happening, rather than through the managed disclosure the palace would have preferred. Edward came to Marlborough House to see his mother in November 1936. What was said between them is not fully documented. Edward's later account, recorded in his memoir A King's Story, and in letters written after Mary's death, suggests that he came looking for something that his mother either could not or would not give. Some acknowledgement of the personal reality of what he was going through, some recognition that her son was a person in a situation rather than an heir in a procedural difficulty. Mary's account, preserved in letters she wrote afterward and in her diary, focuses on duty, on what the role required, on what the institution could accommodate and what it could not. She wrote to him. Letters are available in excerpted form in several published sources. Their register is consistent, formal, concerned in the institutional sense, precise about what was owed to the crown. They do not engage with what her son might be feeling. They do not acknowledge any sentence that historians have been able to quote, the private cost of what he was being asked to do. Maintain the position that duty was the answer to his question, at a moment when his question was not about duty. He signed the instrument of abdication on December 10, 1936. 3 of his brothers stood as witnesses. Mary was not present. She was at Marlborough House. That evening, Edward gave his farewell radio broadcast. He had been the king for 11 months, 42 years old, was voluntarily leaving the throne of the most powerful remaining empire on earth for a woman his family would not receive. Mary did not attend the broadcast. She did not send a message acknowledging it in any warm personal sense. She wrote in her diary that she did not remember feeling such a shock in her life. Was the sentence that grief had produced in the language of composure. On December 12, son was created Duke of Windsor and left England that night. He would not return for any extended period for the remainder of her life. Years that followed established the pattern that would define the rest of her life in relation to her eldest son. Letters were exchanged. Edward's were, by every account, those of a man trying to maintain a connection that was being progressively removed from him. He asked for his wife to receive the title of Royal Highness, which had been withheld from Wallis in a decision that the palace never formally explained but which amounted to a permanent official notation that Wallis Simpson was not, and would not be treated as, a member of the royal family. He asked for an opportunity to be useful in some capacity during the war. He asked his mother to meet Wallis. The title was withheld. Wartime role was limited to the governorship of the Bahamas, a posting designed to keep him occupied and geographically distant. Mary never met Wallis. The letters she sent back addressed the formal questions and sidestepped the personal ones. Cheerfulness in the correspondence was reported as harder to bear than anger would have been. Edward lived in France after the war. Paris, and in a country house in the outskirts, with Wallace maintaining a social existence that was grand in its surface and hollow in its substance. He had the title and none of the function. He had the status but no role to inhabit. He received visitors, gave interviews, played golf, tended dinners, accumulated the reputation of a man trying to give shape to an existence that had been evacuated of its intended content. His wife managed their household with the efficiency and control that she brought to everything. And the household was polished, and the dinners were excellent, and the guests went home wondering what to make of a dinner party hosted by a man who abdicated an empire for the opportunity to give it. He wrote a memoir, he wrote letters, he watched his brother be king with a mixture of feelings that he was more transparent about in private than in public. He watched his niece Elizabeth succeed his brother and be crowned in June 1953. He was not invited to the coronation. Matter of his invitation was not formally adjudicated, because his mother died in March of that year, 10 weeks before the ceremony. He flew from France for her funeral. He stood in the chapel, he walked behind the coffin, and in the days or hours afterward, counts vary slightly on the timing, he described the fluid in her veins as having always been as icy cold in death as it was in life. Sentences, 12 words, and unfair in the way grief weaponized becomes unfair. Also accurate in the way that grief sustained for 17 years against a person who never acknowledged it builds a case from evidence. He was not wrong about the coldness, he was wrong about its meaning. The ice in his mother was not indifference. It was the formation of a woman who had been frightened into structure before she was old enough to understand structure as a choice. People who are the product of that kind of formation generally cannot make that distinction. Wound does not explain itself to the person carrying it. The full record of communication between Mary and Edward in the weeks of the abdication crisis includes material that has been partially published in various biographies, summarized in others, in some cases preserved in the royal archives in ways that are not accessible to independent researchers. Can be assembled from published sources, gives a picture of the communication that is in its gaps as significant as its content. Edward told his mother in their November conversation at Marlborough House that he intended to marry Wallis Simpson. He told her that if the marriage was not possible as king, he would abdicate. He was asking, in the underlying structure of the conversation, for his mother to use whatever influence she had with the institution and with the public situation to create a space in which he could remain king, also have the life he wanted. He was asking her to help him. She told him that the marriage was impossible. She told him what the institution required. She told him what had been done by every member of the family before him, who had been required to put institution's requirements before their personal preferences. She did not, in any account of the conversation that has been recorded, tell him that she understood why he was asking, or that she was sorry for the position he was in, or that whatever happened she would remain his mother in the personal sense that the role of mother carries when it is fully inhabited. He left Marlborough House without the help he had come for. The letter that followed from Mary, dated November 25, 1936, quoted in excerpted form in several published sources, maintained the register that the conversation had established. She wrote about duty. She wrote about the weight of history and the obligations of the role. She wrote in one line that has been quoted with some frequency, she could not understand how he could possibly consider giving up all this for something that seemed to her so terrible. Something that seemed so terrible was Wallis Simpson, or more precisely was the idea that a personal emotional attachment could be considered of equivalent weight to the Crown's requirements. The letter was not unkind in the explicit sense. Unkind in the specific way that letters are unkind when they address what you said but not what you meant. They engage with the formal content of your request while moving around the personal content of your distress. He had said, want to marry this woman. He had meant, I am alone in a way I have been alone for 40 years, and she is the first person who has ever made me feel not alone, and I need you to acknowledge that this is real and that I am real. Letter addressed the institutional implications of the first sentence and did not touch the second. His reply maintained his position. He would not give up Wallis. He was prepared to abdicate if the marriage was not otherwise possible. He wrote back in the same carefully formal register, which was the only register available to both of them, which meant that the conversation that mattered was never, in any document available, having taken place. Abdication was signed on December 10. He left on December 12. The formal exchange of letters continued for years afterward. Pattern established in November 1936 was never revised. The relationship between Queen Mary and Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, who became Queen Consort Elizabeth when she married Bertie in 1923, and Queen Mother Elizabeth after his death in 1952, one of the longest and most consequential female relationships in British royal history, also one of the least documented in its private dimensions. What the record shows is approval, and then sustained mutual support, and the specific intimacy that develops between two women who have occupied the same role at different periods, and who understand its requirements from the inside. What the record does not show is the private texture of the relationship. They said to each other, in the conversations that were not recorded, they thought of each other when they were not performing the relationship for an audience, whether they liked each other in the ordinary sense that people who spend decades in each other's company are required to eventually address. Approval came first. Mary had assessed the women her sons were likely to marry with the thoroughness she brought to all assessments. Bertie told her that he intended to marry Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon. Mary's initial response was one of cautious support. Elizabeth was Scottish, meant English enough in the relevant sense. She was aristocratic, the daughter of the Earl of Strathmore. She was young and attractive in the easy, warm manner that made rooms comfortable around her, which was a quality Mary recognized as socially valuable even if she did not fully share it. She was in the key assessment suitable. Mary may not have fully anticipated was how completely Elizabeth would inhabit the role she entered, how the warmth that Mary found socially useful would become, in the following decades, quality that the public associated with the monarchy in ways that quietly rebalanced the family's public image. Elizabeth was good with people in the specific way that made people feel they had been noticed, and this quality, deployed across the wartime years and the post-war years and the decades of public service that followed, produced a public relationship with the crown that was more intimate than anything the corrective household of George and May had generated. Mary watched this. She was not in the record threatened by it. She was, if anything, something closer to admiring, a limited way that Mary admired qualities she did not herself possess. Elizabeth did something useful for the institution and did it well. Institution was the priority. The relationship deepened during the abdication. Elizabeth had been a consistent supporter of George VI's claims to the throne in the sense that she had been a consistent supporter of her husband, and when the abdication made Bertie king, she became queen consort with a speed and a thoroughness that struck everyone who watched it as remarkable. She had not expected the role in the sense that she had married a man who was expected to spend his life as a secondary royal and had organized her personal preferences accordingly. When the role arrived, she entered it and did not look back. Mary's letters to Elizabeth during the war years suggest a relationship that had become, by that point, genuinely warm in the specific register of warmth that Mary was capable of. She wrote with concern for Bertie's health and with what reads, in the biographer's accounts, like genuine affection for the household her son and daughter-in-law had built. Household that contained children and laughter, and the easy warmth of two people who had actually chosen each other, which was something that May had never quite managed for herself, and which she appears to have valued in her son's house in the way of someone who recognizes a quality they respect from the outside. The two women outlived their husbands and outlived the formal distance that their respective roles required, and the later years, when Mary was the dowager and Elizabeth was the queen mother, and both of them were women managing the specific position of being the surviving generation, produced a closeness that the earlier years had not fully permitted. They were the same kind of woman in the ways that mattered. They understood the institution from the inside. They understood what it cost. Both paid the cost and were continuing to pay it. Mary died first in March 1953, and left Elizabeth to manage the inheritance of the institution that both of them had spent their lives maintaining. Elizabeth managed it for another 50 years, dying in March 2002 at the age of 101, outliving her daughter by 7 months. Relationship between Queen Mary and Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, who became first Duchess of York, then Princess of Wales, then Queen Mother over the course of 3 decades, was one of the defining personal dynamics of the modern British monarchy. It was conducted almost entirely in the register of correct performance, which makes it extremely difficult to read directly. Is known as this. Mary approved of Elizabeth from the beginning. She approved of the match in 1923 and expressed her approval clearly. She liked what Elizabeth brought to her second son: stability, warmth, social competence. She acknowledged that Bertie's marriage had done for him something that she herself had been unable to do, which was provide a context in which he could develop with something other than anxiety as his primary condition. She acknowledged this in her way, is to say, with private diary entries and formal expressions of approval, rather than with any public statement that might have implied self-examination. Elizabeth's feelings toward her mother-in-law were more complicated, and the complication was managed in Elizabeth's characteristic way, being warm on the surface and private underneath. She was, by the accounts of those who knew her well, deeply shrewd. She had the kind of emotional intelligence that allows a person to maintain one presentation while experiencing something quite different. She used it in every context she moved through. In public, she was warm toward Queen Mary. She behaved with perfect correctness. She observed the formal hierarchies. In private, to the small number of people she trusted with her actual assessment, she was more direct. She found Mary's coldness genuinely alien, in the way that people who are constitutionally warm find coldness in a parent figure alien, merely different but wrong. She also found, in the years after the abdication, her feelings toward Mary were complicated by her feelings toward David, because the two things were connected. Whatever Mary had done or not done with David had produced the situation in which her husband was now required to be king, and her husband was carrying a weight that his formation had not prepared him to carry. Weight was going to be paid for in the currency of his health. Elizabeth did not apparently raise these feelings with Mary directly. Raising of feelings was not a method available in the social world they both inhabited in any meaningful way. She was, instead, simply warm and correct, and underneath the warmth and the correctness, she was building the particular species of opinion that is formed when a very intelligent person watches a situation for decades and makes their private assessment. Her assessment of David was formed across the same period. Abdication in December 1936 produced in Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon a response that was, in terms of its sustained duration, extraordinary. She maintained her anger at the Duke of Windsor for the rest of her very long life. She referred to him in private terms that were not charitable. She supported the withholding of Wallace's title. She did not advocate for his return or his reintegration. She had decided in December 1936 that he had done something to her family that was unforgivable, and she did not change her position in the 65 years she lived after the abdication. Mary shared the institutional judgment without the personal fury. Her response to David was the response of a woman who had closed a door. Precise, permanent, and not accompanied by visible anger. She did not appear to hate him. She appeared to have concluded that the relationship was over in the sense that was meaningful to her, which was the institutional sense. Personal dimension of it was manageable by being largely set aside. The two women, one who burned at the injustice of it, and one who catalogued it and moved forward, were in some ways perfectly suited to cooperate in the management of the institution's response to the crisis. They did cooperate, in the formal sense, without ever discussing with each other what the crisis had meant personally to either of them. Princess Mary, the only daughter, born in April 1897 and married in February 1922. She was 24. Henry Lascelles, Viscount Lascelles, was 39. He was wealthy, aristocratic, culturally engaged in the manner of a certain type of Edwardian grandee. He had an important art collection. He sat on the boards of cultural institutions. He was considered a man of taste and of some intellectual weight by the circles he moved in. He was also, by the consistent accounts of those who knew him, cold. Not cold in the manner of someone who had never possessed warmth. Cold in the manner of someone who had organized himself around the management of warmth as a strategic resource. He gave it when it served him and withheld it as a form of control. The people around him who were subjected to the withholding found it precise and deliberate in a way that was difficult to manage. This description, which appears in enough accounts from people who knew Henry Lascelles that it can, taken as reliable, raises an obvious question about why Mary approved the match for her daughter. Question has been addressed in published accounts primarily by suggesting that Mary's approval was based on the institutional suitability of the match, which was genuine. Lascelles was wealthy, titled, British, without the kind of complicating personal associations that had made earlier potential candidates difficult. He was suitable in every formal dimension. What these accounts less frequently address is whether May recognized, in Lascelles's specific emotional management style, something that was not unfamiliar to her, and whether her recognition of it was reassuring rather than alarming. A man who maintained his warmth carefully and withheld it as a form of control, As a man who was not going to be emotionally demanding in the ways that May herself found difficult to manage. He was not going to expect the kind of personal emotional availability from his wife that Mary was not constitutionally equipped to provide. In the most uncomfortable version of this reading, May chose for her daughter a husband who was going to manage the emotional dimension of the marriage in a way that was consistent with how Mary herself had learned to manage it. Princess Mary spent the following decades as Countess of Harewood, then Countess Harewood, then Princess Royal when she was granted the title in 1932. She had two sons, George Henry Hubert, born 1923, who became the seventh Earl of Harewood and who was later known for his work on opera and for two marriages and various public controversies, and Gerald Lascelles, born 1924, who pursued his own independent life at some distance from the royal mainstream. Mary visited her daughter at Harewood House, Yorkshire estate that was the Lascelles family seat. She assessed the household with the eye she brought to all households. She noted, presumably, things about its management and its placement of objects. She maintained correct relations with her son-in-law. Princess Mary was happy in the marriage is a question the record does not answer straightforwardly. She did not leave published accounts of her private life. She did not give interviews of the kind that would have permitted later biographers to construct a psychological portrait. She performed the role of Countess of Harewood, and later Princess Royal with the correctness she had been trained bring to everything, and died in March 1965 aged 67, in her home at Harewood House. She died suddenly of a heart attack while walking in the garden. She was found by her son. The death was, by all accounts available, unexpected. Henry Lascelles had died 18 years before her in 1947. Whatever the marriage had been, she had outlived it. During the war years, Mary had left London for Badminton Park in Gloucestershire, the home of her niece, Mary Somerset, Duchess of Beaufort. This arrangement was presented. Most arrangements involving Queen Mary were presented as a matter of necessary convenience. The evacuating of a senior royal from the bombing risk of central London. In practice, it was the arrival of a small court inside someone else's house. She brought 55 members of staff. She brought more than 70 pieces of luggage. She brought her routines, her requirements, her expectations, and her household's hierarchies, which were reproduced intact inside the Duchess of Beaufort's existing household, subordinating the latter to the former with the smooth inevitability of a tide covering a beach. The Duchess of Beaufort found this difficult. Various accounts record the friction, though the Duchess's own private expression of it was constrained by the same social machinery that constrained her ability to prevent the situation in the first place. You did not tell Queen Mary no. You did not tell Queen Mary that her 55 staff were a disruption. You did not suggest to Queen Mary that the management of her household requirements was becoming a burden on yours. You adjusted. You absorbed. You waited. The stripping of the ivory was the detail that outlasted the war in the family accounts. Mary found the ivory inlay in the walls of certain rooms at Badminton decoratively incorrect. She removed it. The authority of her aesthetic judgment, position as a woman who had spent 60 years curating the appropriate placement of beautiful things, such that she implemented her corrections to a house she did not own, whose owner was present and watching. Without apparently finding it necessary to ask, the Duchess waited that out as well. Mary was not inactive during the war. She organized salvage drives in the Gloucestershire countryside. She recruited the local population to the effort of reclaiming materials for the war industry, which she approached with the same organizational energy she had brought to the royal collection. Identify the waste, recover the waste, place the recovered material where it will serve best. She drove through the lanes in her car and offered lifts to soldiers she encountered. Became one of the most frequently told stories about her wartime years because of the comedy of the encounter. Young men who had not expected their next ride to be offered by a very erect elderly woman in an enormous hat. She visited military facilities. She corresponded with George VI, her second son, and with his wife Elizabeth, who was managing the wartime monarchy in London with the public composure and private fury that characterized everything she did. Palace had been bombed in September 1940 during the Blitz, and Elizabeth Beauvais-Lyon had reportedly been glad of it because it made the crown visible as sharing the East End's suffering. Mary read about the bombing and expressed concern for her son and daughter-in-law. She did not, in any correspondence from this period that has been published, express anything about the other son, had been sent to the Bahamas in June 1940 and who was spending the war administering a small island colony at a safe distance from Europe. Bahamas posting was not an accident. British intelligence, and it emerged decades later, American intelligence, concerns about the Duke of Windsor's sympathies. He had visited Germany in October 1937, had met Hitler, had made various public statements about the war and about Germany that were logged and worried over by enough people in enough governments to constitute a liability. Whether his sympathies were genuinely pro-German, or whether he was simply a man of substantial vanity who was susceptible to flattery from powerful men, and whether there is a meaningful difference between those two things, historians have argued for 80 years. Not argued about is that the British government of the time wanted him occupied and contained, and that the Bahamas was both. He served as governor of the Bahamas until 1945. He was not recalled to any significant role after the war ended. David, the Duke of Windsor, England on December 12, 1936, on the destroyer HMS Fury, sailing from Portsmouth to France in the night. He was 42 years old. He had been king for 326 days. He had signed the abdication instrument. His brothers had witnessed it. Parliament had confirmed it, and the process by which he had moved from second in line to king, to no longer king in under a year, was complete. Wallis was already in France, having left England in November, when the press situation began to make her continued presence in Britain untenable. She had been staying at a house in the south of France, belonging to Herman Rogers, an American friend. David joined her there after a brief period at the Rothschild estate in Austria, where he had gone immediately following the abdication. Were reunited after several weeks and married on June 3, 1937, at the Château de Cande in France. The wedding was a small ceremony. No member of the royal family attended. No representative of the Church of England officiated. Church's position was that the marriage of divorced persons was not appropriate for its ceremonies, while a Church of England clergyman did in fact perform the service. Reverend Robert Anderson Jardine did so without official church authorization and against the express instructions of the Bishop of Durham. The irregularity of his participation became a permanent part of the ceremony's official description. Mary did not attend. George VI did not attend. No one from the family sent a formal representative. The event was noted. The official record moved on. Followed for David and Wallis was the long, strange middle of a life that had been evacuated of its intended content. They moved to Paris, Emiris, and then to a rented house, and then to a house they rented on the Boulevard Suchet. They maintained a social existence that was, its external presentation, the life of a wealthy European aristocrat. Dinners, visits, circuit of houses and resorts that people of that class and income moved through. They went to Germany in October 1937, invitation of the German Labour Front, and toured industrial facilities, and met officials, and met Hitler at the Berghof above Berchtesgaden. Visit was photographed extensively. The photographs were published. The British government's view of the visit was not publicly expressed at the time but was recorded in diplomatic correspondence. The government had not been enthusiastic about the trip. Photographs were a problem of the kind that photographs of former kings meeting dictators tend to be. They existed, they were in the archive. They would be referenced for the rest of David's life by people who found them useful evidence for the construction of a particular interpretation of his character. Whether David was genuinely sympathetic to German fascism, or whether he was a man whose vanity made him susceptible to the kind of reception that fascist governments were very skilled at providing to visiting international figures of prestige, is a question the record does not answer conclusively. What the record shows is that he made the visit. He made statements about the war in the years that followed, that were logged by multiple intelligence services. By the time the war began in September 1939, the question of where to put the Duke of Windsor was actively discussed at the highest levels of British government. The Bahamas posting from July 1940 until March 1945 was David's wartime contribution. He administered the colony with competence, addressed some genuine social and economic problems in Nassau, spent 5 years being governor of a place that had the surface of significance and the reality of exile. He wrote to his family. He wrote to his mother. He wrote asking for things: the title for Wallis, the ability to return to Britain, some form of useful employment in the war effort, some acknowledgement that he remained a person of relevance to the institution he had left. Letters produced careful formal responses. The title question was not addressed in a way that resolved it. Wartime role was limited to the Bahamas. The returning to Britain was managed in ways that kept it from happening in any substantial way. Brother the King maintained a private communication with him. that was warmer than the official position required, but not warm enough to constitute the kind of genuine reintegration that David was seeking. Mary's letters to him from this period, they have been quoted or summarized in published sources, maintain the register that characterized everything she wrote to him from December 193, 6 onward. Formally correct, concerned with duty and position, careful to address the specific points he raised without engaging with the dimension of request that was personal. He was asking, in various forms, for his mother to acknowledge that he was her son, and that she wanted to see him, and whatever he had done, he remained the person she had raised and had known for 42 years before the abdication. She addressed the formal content of his letters. She did not address the personal request. After the Bahamas, after the war, the pattern continued. Came to Britain once in 1947 for a brief visit and met briefly with the king. David saw Mary. The meeting is described in David's accounts. Correct and brief and largely formal. She was in her early 80s. He was in his early 50s. Sat in the same room and talked in the manner of two people who had agreed by long practice to conduct their relationship on the surface. Surface held. His memoir, A King's Story, was published in 1951. It was written with the assistance of a ghostwriter and describes his life with self-presentation that memoirs by ex-kings tend to adopt, dignified, reasonably candid about the public record, careful about the private reality. He described his mother with a respect that did not quite conceal the grievance underneath it. He described his father with the complicated mixture of fear and love that characterized his accounts of George in every interview and conversation he gave. He described the abdication as an act of personal conscience rather than as a failure of duty, which was the only description that allowed him to live with it. He had 3 more decades after the memoir. He spent them in the Boulevard Suchet house in Paris and in the country house at Gif-sur-Yvette, in the movement between houses that wealthy people of leisure maintain in the south of France, and in New York and in the other stations of their particular circuit. He and Wallace gave interviews. He was photographed. He attended dinners. He visited people and received visits. He maintained the social existence of a man who had once been at the center of everything and had chosen, or been forced, or both, to move to the periphery. His mother died in March 1953. He went to the funeral. He stood in the chapel. He walked behind the coffin. 12 words were said, or reported, or attributed to him, in the hours afterward. Accuracy of the 12 words as a description of the woman in the coffin was, as has been noted, complicated. The grief they expressed was real, because the grief of a child for the withholding of something that should have been available is the realest kind of grief, is the grief of the permanent loss of something that was never adequately present to be lost. He died on May 28, 1972, Boulevard Suchet House in Paris. He had throat cancer. In May of 1972, just weeks before his death, he received a visit from his niece Elizabeth II, who was in Paris on a state visit. The visit was arranged and carried out, and the photographs from it show the two of them together. The old man in his house in Paris, Queen who had been crowned the year his mother died, meeting at last without the structure of the institution between them. He was dying. Came to see him. He died 10 days later. His funeral was at St. George's Chapel, Windsor. He was buried at Frogmore. Wallace, whom he had left the throne of the British Empire to marry, attended the funeral as the Duchess of Windsor, without the title Royal Highness. She had been denied since December 1936. She attended in her role as his widow, correct and diminished, and returned to France afterward. The house where she lived till her own death in April 1986, by then largely blind and cared for by nurses, and very difficult. Mary's understanding of the British Empire was institutional, in the same way that her understanding of the monarchy was institutional. It was a structure that justified itself through its continuation, and the job of the people inside it was to maintain the continuation. Did not spend significant energy examining the empire's moral foundations or the specific human costs of the colonial project, because the framework she inhabited did not require this examination and in fact made it difficult to perform. This is not a defense. It is a description of how a person formed in the period, and the class she was formed in, experienced the world she lived in. The empire was a given. The context, it was the word that went in front of India, and that described what happened when they sailed to the Durbar and wore the crowns, accepted the jewels, and presented themselves to the subcontinent as its sovereigns. She accepted this as the natural order of her world, because her world was organized around the natural order of things. Natural order was the order that maintained the institution. The Delhi Durbar photographs show her in enormous jewels and imperial dress, beside George in his ceremonial uniform, on a dais above the assembled representatives of the empire they had been declared to govern. She looks as she always looks, correct. She is wearing the role correctly. She is present, composed, performing the function with the thoroughness that the function requires. Whether she thought, as the assembly organized itself below her, the people whose country she was being crowned over, there is no document to suggest. There was no framework available to her at the time that would have produced the question, in the form it would be asked now. She was the queen. She was the empress. The ceremony said so. She wore it correctly. What the empire gave her personally, beyond the ceremonies, was the jewels. Indian tour of 1911 produced a significant addition to the personal collection she was building. Maharajas of the principal states understood that giving gifts to the king and queen was both expected and strategic, and they gave accordingly. The generosity of men for whom the gift was also an argument about their own position and loyalty. Mary received pieces that were extraordinary in their quality and provenance, and she received them with the pleasure of a woman who had been looking at beautiful things since childhood, and who had the knowledge to understand exactly what she was looking at. She also received them with the cataloguing instinct that characterized everything she did with objects. She noted them, documented their provenance, understood their history, and integrated them into the larger story she was building of the royal collection as the material expression of the institution's continuity. Indian jewels in the royal collection were not simply beautiful objects. They were evidence of imperial reach, of the empire's gifts flowing toward the center's capacity to receive and preserve what the empire provided. Collection she built over the decades of her residence at Buckingham Palace included this Indian material alongside the English and European pieces she acquired through the other methods. The mixture is, in its assemblage, a map of the empire's geography as well as the institution's history. After her death, many of the jewels she owned passed to Elizabeth II, who wore some of them and placed others in the vaults of the royal collection. The Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara Mary had given Elizabeth in 1947 as a wedding gift became the most publicly associated piece, worn in countless official photographs, appearing on the banknote that carried Elizabeth's image, recognized globally as the default image of the Queen's tiara. Began as a gift to May on her wedding day in 1893, passed to her granddaughter at her granddaughter's wedding in 1947, subsequently worn into the 21st century. The objects endured. She had understood that about objects since Florence. She had been right. George VI returned from the war having spent 6 years as the visible public face of a nation under attack. He had stood in bombed streets. He had visited troops. He had given speeches in his careful, controlled voice, managing the impediment that had been his particular difficulty since childhood, managing it better by the late 1940s than he had in the 1920s, but never free of it. Speeches were delivered with the effort that his stammer required, and that effort was legible to the people who heard him. The effect was a kind of intimacy. They could hear him fighting for the words, and they could hear him winning. Winning was personal and real, and connected them to him in a way that effortless delivery never could have. War also cost him what remained of his health. He smoked heavily, as men of his period and class almost universally did, without the knowledge of what they were doing to themselves. His circulation was poor. In 1949, doctors discovered an arterial blockage in his left leg serious enough to require surgery, and removed part of his left lung in 1951 when lung cancer was identified. He recovered from each procedure, continued working, continued performing the role with the same deliberate discipline that had always characterized him, and died at Sandringham on February 6, 1952, aged 56 in his sleep. His daughter Elizabeth was in Kenya on the morning that the news reached her, at Treetops Lodge in the Aberdare forest. She had been watching animals through the night. A telephoned message came. Her private secretary, Martin Charteris, found her at the lodge and told her. She walked away briefly, then returned and asked what needed to be done. She flew home the next day, Queen Mary received the news at Marlborough House. She was 84 years old. She had survived her husband by 16 years and had now outlived her second son. She was composed, as she was always composed. Grief she expressed in diary and correspondence was of the precise, measured kind that her formation allowed. She had loved Bertie. He had been the son who accepted the burden she could not prevent the institution from placing on him, and had carried it with a decency that she appears to have genuinely admired. That he had carried it to his death at 56 was in the diary, recorded as a loss. The recording was correct. Depth of whatever lay beneath the recording is not available. In the months following George VI's death, Mary continued her engagement with public life at the level her health permitted. She attended events, she maintained her correspondence, she sent instructions and opinions and notes about the royal collection to the new Queen's household. She had opinions always, how things should be arranged. She had also, by the summer of 1952, been given a diagnosis she did not publicly acknowledge, cancer. Specific form was not detailed in the early public record, and she declined for some time to accept its implications for her schedule. 85, and had been in generally robust health for her age. Her response to illness was consistent with her response to most other forms of adversity. Acknowledge it as required. Perform correctly in spite of it, and do not allow it to be the visible organizing fact of her public presentation. What she had decided she wanted, above any other remaining ambition in the final year of her life, was to see her granddaughter's coronation. Coronation of Elizabeth II was scheduled for June 2, 1953. Mary had been involved in discussions around the planning. She had been involved in coronations before, her own and her husband's, and she had views about how they should be conducted. She intended to be present. She had made this clear. She had arranged her attendance in her mind as a fact about her future that she was entitled to. February 1953, she contracted a respiratory illness. She continued her usual activities through March. She attended a private viewing of the exhibition of coronation regalia at the Victoria and Albert Museum on March 19. She visited her granddaughter. She maintained the habits of a lifetime, wearing them as she wore her clothes, precisely and deliberately. On March 24, 1953, Mary died at Marlborough House, aged 85. 10 weeks before the coronation, she had left instructions, written out clearly, as she wrote everything, in the certain knowledge that she was approaching the end, and that arrangements needed to be made. Instructions specified that in the event of her death before the coronation, the ceremony should proceed without delay or modification. No extended mourning period, no alteration of the plans. The new Queen's crowning had been prepared for, and the country had been waiting for it. A grandmother's death, however regrettable its timing, should not be made into a reason to postpone what the institution required. Instructions were followed. Elizabeth II was crowned at Westminster Abbey on June 2, 1953, without her grandmother in the audience. Photographs from that day show a young woman in ancient dress in an ancient ceremony, carrying the accumulated weight of everything that had gone before her: the gold anointing spoon, the orb and scepter, crown that had been placed on her grandmother's head in that same abbey on a different June morning in 1911. Mary R's collection remained in the custody of the Crown. The notes she had sent to the new household, continuing her cataloguing work into the last years of her life, remained in the files. Her initials were on the inventories of thousands of objects across the various royal residences. She had marked what she had built. Funeral was held at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, on March 31, 1953. The Duke of Windsor flew from France. He walked in the procession, stood in the chapel. Whatever he felt inside the chapel is not recorded. What he said outside it, in the hours that followed, was recorded. 12 words about the fluid in her veins. He returned to France. He would live until May 1972. He would spend those 19 years in the country house outside Paris, with Wallace, attaining a life that had the external form of the existence he had been formed to occupy but none of its content. He had given up the crown. He had given it up for a woman who was denied by his family the title that marriage to him should have carried. He had been exiled from the country that had been his country since birth, and the woman who had overseen most of this was gone. He felt about that. He put in 12 words and went back to France. Wallis Simpson lived until April 24, 1986. She outlived her husband by 14 years, spending much of the time in the Paris house, cared for by nurses who found her by late accounts. Very difficult. The title she had been denied for 5 decades was still denied when she died. Buried at Frogmore at Windsor, beside her husband, she received the state funeral that the Duke of Windsor had arranged as a wish in his will. Queen and Prince Philip attended the burial. The irony of this attendance, after everything, is available for whoever finds it useful. George VI's widow, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, who became officially the Queen Mother on June 2, 1953, when her daughter was crowned, until March 30, 2002, she was 101 years old. She outlived her husband by 50 years and her mother-in-law by 49. She spent those years being publicly adored in a way that her mother-in-law had never quite managed, because Mary was less capable of public presentation, but because Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon understood charm in a way that was different and more immediate and more available to warmth. The two women had coexisted in the same institution for nearly 30 years, 1923 when Elizabeth married Bertie until 1952 when the old queen died. They had been courteous to each other. They had managed, in the space of a family that valued correct performance over direct communication, relationship that was mutually respectful and mutually constrained. What they actually thought of each other, private assessments that both women were entirely capable of making, is partly preserved and partly still decently buried. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon blamed David, the Duke of Windsor, for putting her husband on a throne that killed him. She blamed Wallis Simpson as the instrumental cause of the situation. She maintained both positions for the rest of her long life. Mary's role in what happened, the ways in which the household she had built had produced the people who broke it, not something Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon appears to have publicly examined. Her mother-in-law was dead. The institution continued. Next generation was Elizabeth II, who had been correctly prepared by the same system for the role she now held. Correctness of Elizabeth II's preparation was a point Mary had focused on from the beginning. From the moment it became clear, after 1936, the granddaughter born in April 1926 was going to be queen, Mary took an active interest in her formation. She visited. She talked with her about history and duty and the requirements of the role. She gave the girl knowledge that was genuine. Grandmother had been watching the institution from inside for 6 decades, and she knew it in ways that no formal education could have supplied. Elizabeth received this knowledge and used it. The longest reign in British history, which ended only in 2022, in some portion the product of everything Mary understood about what sustained an institution against the pressure of a changing world, is one of the truths about Mary that the simpler version of a character, the one built on the cruelties and the coldness and the exiles, tends to obscure. She was not merely destructive, she built something real. She built it with methods that were often unkind and sometimes genuinely wrong, and what she built was real in spite of that, possibly because of it, in the way that some structures hold precisely because they were assembled without softness. Question is whether that is a thing to admire. There is a version of Queen Mary that her defenders assembled in the decades after her death, a woman formed by circumstances that gave her no room for softness, who channeled everything into an institution that survived and served and continued, who was not unkind by intention, but by formation, who paid her own costs before she charged others. This version is not entirely wrong. It simply explains more than it excuses. She chose in the margins of a life that genuinely contained very little room for personal deviation. To be as cold as she was, the formation was real. The choices within it were also real. Bertie needed her to intervene in the household dynamics that were damaging him. She did not. John needed her to be present at Wood Farm in a sustained way. She was not. David needed her to look at him rather than at the role he was failing. She looked at the role. Princess Mary was walking toward a cold older husband. May concluded that suitability was sufficient. These were decisions, each of them, made in a formation that made them feel like the only available decisions. But the formation does not close off all choices in all circumstances. Evidence of that is Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, who grew up in a large aristocratic family with its own difficulties and its own demands, and became a woman who could give warmth to her husband and her daughters, and to the public, could make the choice to be available in a way that May never made. The difference between the two women then is the difference between someone who looked at her formation and built something from it that she could pass on unchanged, someone who looked at what she had been given and decided that the parts of it that had failed her, she would not pass to the next generation. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was not a perfect person. Her treatment of David and Wallis in the decades after the abdication was sustained and sometimes petty and occasionally cruel in its own right. But she was warm to her daughters and to her husband in the way that May was not warm to anyone in an equivalent position. May looked at her children and saw roles to be filled. Elizabeth looked at her children and saw people to be loved. Royal collection that Mary built, catalogued, marked and defended across 6 decades, is still in the custody of the Crown. Royal Collection Trust manages thousands of objects in the palaces and residences across the country. Significant portion of them bear the mark of her attention. The Chinese Chippendale Room at Buckingham Palace, Gun in 1912 with the interior decorator Charles Allam, remains. The inventories she annotated, the receipts she made notes on, catalogues carrying her initials, remain in the Trust's archives. She inscribed herself indelibly on the record of what the institution owns. Objects she acquired from other people's houses are harder to trace individually, because the method of acquisition was not always formally documented. They are there, chairs and the vases and the furniture, and the pieces of jewelry, and the miniatures, absorbed into the collection along with the rest. Family feeling toward their absence from where they started is lost in time. The Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara was given to May on her wedding day in 1893, and which she gave to her granddaughter Elizabeth in 1947, being worn periodically by Elizabeth II in official portraits, is the tiara most associated with the Queen in photographs from the middle decades of the century. It was photographed on the head of Catherine, Princess of Wales. It passes forward. The jewels tell the story that the institution prefers. They are beautiful and they endure, and they carry names that connect to other names, that connect to the whole long chain of who wore them when and what they wore them for. Mary R. is on the catalogues. The chain continues. She was not the monument the portraits suggest. She was something more human and more difficult, and the difficulty has taken a century to document fully, because the institution she served was not inclined to document it, and the people she damaged were not always in a position to say what had been done. The closest accounting, one that sits most honestly with what the record permits, goes something like this. She was a woman who was frightened very early, who responded to the fear by building a structure that could not be frightened. The structure was real and it was formidable and it lasted. Children who grew up inside it paid for its solidity in ways she did not calculate, because she did not have the conceptual equipment to make calculation. She was not a villain in the sense that villainy requires choosing harm over an available alternative. She was also not the innocent product of a formation that left her no choices. She had the intelligence to see, if she had looked, she was doing. She chose not to look, or she looked and did not find it necessary to change what she saw, because the alternative to her method was a vulnerability she had decided in Florence at 16 that she would never permit. Vulnerability was never permitted. The children paid. The eldest son paid for 50 years in exile in a house in Paris, careful maintenance of a social life that could not replace what he had left. The second son paid with his health and his years, the speeches he forced through the stammer and the cigarettes that took his left lung, and then his life at 56. Daughter paid in a marriage that was suitable and cold. The last son paid in a cottage at Sandringham, with Lala. Children May had arranged to visit him, dying at 13 while his mother recorded, in her diary, that the relief was real. What does it mean to understand a person like this? The easy answer is to pick a position, monster or victim, cold by choice or cold by formation. Honest answer is that these are not mutually exclusive. She was both. The formation was real and the choices within it were real. The line between them shifts depending on which moment you examine. What is clearest, when you look at the full span of her 85 years, she was a person who arranged things, who looked at a situation and identified the correct configuration and then worked, patience, and a discipline that were genuinely extraordinary to achieve it. She arranged the furniture at Badminton in the way she found correct. She arranged the royal collection according to the logic of historical continuity. She arranged her children in the positions the institution required and expected the positions to hold, confused or perhaps simply unmoved when the positions did not hold people the way furniture holds its place. She arranged the abdication crisis in the sense that she participated in its resolution without offering her eldest son the one thing that might changed it, or at least might have changed how it was remembered, her acknowledgement that he was a person, not just a failure. She arranged the exile, she arranged the denial of the title, she arranged through the slow application of silence maintained over decades, distance that Edward carried to her coffin, and she arranged in the instructions she left, coronation of her granddaughter would proceed without modification. The institution first, the institution always, it proceeded, it proceeds. Go back to Florence one more time. The 16-year-old girl in the churches and the galleries and the marble rooms, learning about permanence. She looked at the objects and she understood something true about them. They lasted beyond the people who owned them, carried meaning across generations that the people themselves could not carry. Medici were gone. and their rooms remained, and their commission of Botticelli remained, and the story they wanted told was still being told in the paintings they had paid for. She built her version of this. She marked it with her initials. She organized it according to the logic that she had absorbed in a city she had been brought to by her parents' inability to pay their bills. Irony of this has its own completeness. The girl who went to Florence because of debt, who learned in Florence about the permanence of things, who spent the rest of her life securing and cataloguing and marking things in defiance of the precariousness she had been born into, died at 85 and left behind the largest and most carefully documented private contribution to the royal collection in the institutions. In history, the things last. She was right about that. She was also wrong about the people. People she was wrong about paid for her being wrong, and the payment was made in the currency of the only thing she had decided could not be allowed to matter. Feeling coronation of June 2, 1953 proceeded without her. Young queen sat in the ancient chair and received the ancient anointing, and was crowned in the ceremony that had been performed for British monarchs since William the Conqueror, the ceremony that Mary had attended as queen in 1911, and had been preparing, in the background, attend again as grandmother. The camera footage from that day, the first coronation to be televised, shows a woman who had been prepared for this moment and was ready for it. The preparation was, in no small part, work of the woman who had died 10 weeks before. Mary R. had built the collection. Mary R. had maintained the institution across 60 years of its most difficult tests. Mary R. had passed the knowledge of the role to the woman now wearing the crown in ways that formal instruction alone could not have transmitted. Whether Elizabeth II looked at the empty seat where her grandmother might have been and felt loss or relief, or something more complicated than either, the record does not tell us. What the record tells us is that the ceremony proceeded correctly, arranged. She had required Marlborough House on Pall Mall in London, the residence to which Mary moved after George V's death in January 1936, and in which she lived for the remaining 17 years of her life. It was a house with its own history. It had been built in the early 18th century for the first Duke of Marlborough, passed through various occupants over the subsequent 2 centuries, and had been used as the residence of the Prince and Princess of Wales during long decades of Edward VII's wait for the throne. Mary knew it from those years. She moved into it with the household she had constructed over 5 decades of royal life, and she maintained it, against the general historical tendency of houses to decline in significance when the person in them is no longer the first rank. The insistence of a woman who knew that residences communicated status, and that status required maintenance. She continued receiving people. She continued going out. She continued the work of the collection, sending notes and opinions to Buckingham Palace about the proper placement of objects that she had organized and that were now technically someone else's to manage. The receiving was important to her. Marlborough House was a working court in miniature throughout her widowhood, a place where people came to pay their respects to a figure who remained, despite the change in her formal position, one of the most significant people in the monarchy. Younger royals understood this and attended accordingly. She saw them, she assessed them, she expressed her assessments in the precise, formal way that was the only way she had. She took interest in her grandchildren. Elizabeth and Margaret, daughters of George VI and Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, visited Marlborough House and received from their grandmother both the benefit of her knowledge and the slightly constrained experience of being with a woman whose warmth was expressed through information and expectation, rather than through ease. Elizabeth, who was serious and capable and quick in the way that her grandmother recognized and respected, appears to have found the relationship more functional than most. She received from Mary a transfer of knowledge about the institution that was practical and genuine, and that she drew on for the rest of her own long reign. In the autumn of 1938, Munich crisis brought Europe to the edge of war and produced in Mary a response that was consistent with the rest of her character. She supported the government's position, whatever it was, because the government was the government, and the monarchy's role was not to complicate the government's management of foreign policy. She had thoughts about the German question that she occasionally expressed in private correspondence and reflected in ways that are now uncomfortable. Some of the assumptions of her generation about Germany and about the possibilities of accommodation with German power that most people in Britain were only beginning to abandon by 1938 and 1939. These were not unique to her. were the assumptions of a significant portion of the British establishment in those years. When war came in September 1939, she moved to Badminton. The full story of that arrival and its consequences at Badminton has been told earlier in this documentary. What is worth adding here is the quality of her wartime engagement with the countryside, which was genuine, and which represents one of the more appealing aspects of her character in those years. She organized the local salvage effort. She drove through Gloucestershire in her car, accompanied by her equerry and her lady-in-waiting, collected scrap metal and other materials from farms and roadsides with the same focused organizational energy she had always brought to collecting. The distinction between what was happening here and what happened when she collected objects from aristocratic drawing rooms was that people in the lanes of Gloucestershire gave their salvage voluntarily, cheerfully, with something approaching delight at the experience of contributing their old iron to the war effort in the company of the King's mother. She gave them an experience, they gave her their scrap. The soldiers she gave lifts to were young men from the Midlands and the north of England. The accounts they later gave of finding themselves in a very large car beside a very erect and very old woman who asked them polite questions about where they were from and whether they had been doing their duty were told with a combination of bewilderment and warm affection that was entirely genuine. She was in these moments something closer to the grandmother that the public image suggested than she was in any moment with her actual children. The principal accounts of what it was like to work for Queen Mary come from two categories of source. Published memoirs of her ladies-in-waiting, chief among them Lady Airlie's Thatched with Gold, published in 1962, which was constrained by loyalty and by the conventions of discretion that shaped everything written about the royal family in that period. Private accounts that emerged in letters and in conversations recorded by biographers who interviewed survivors after enough time had passed. Lady Airlie, who had known May since before her marriage and served as a close confidant for decades, preserved in her memoir an observation that has been quoted in virtually every subsequent account of the Queen. She wrote that the royal children were strangers to their mother emotionally, that they had become, in the language of Airlie's careful sentence, nest of wild birds already spreading their wings and soaring beyond her horizon. It is a sentence that contains both sympathy and accusation. Airlie was presumably aware of both dimensions when she wrote it. What Airlie was describing was the specific quality of emotional estrangement can exist between parents and children in households where performance of the correct role is valued above the relationship that produces it. Children were not unacknowledged, they were not invisible, they were not unloved in the abstract sense of their parents being indifferent to their welfare. They were simply in the ways that mattered to their development, not seen. Seen as people with an inner life that required attention, seen as roles that required correct occupancy. The ladies-in-waiting spent the most sustained time with Mary of any people in her household outside the domestic staff, described her in terms that clustered around a specific quality, the precision of her regard. She was paying attention. She always knew what was happening in the room. She noticed things that others missed and remembered them with the same clarity she brought to the Royal Collection's provenance records. If you had said something incorrect 3 years ago, she remembered the incorrectness. You had behaved improperly once. The memory was available for reference. She did not usually reference it directly. She referenced it through the quality of her attention afterward, which became, for people who understood what was happening, legible as a form of permanent record. Being outside her regard, several accounts describe, was worse than direct criticism. She could tell you that you had done something wrong and you could correct it. Her version of displeasure was more difficult because it took the form of a cheerful accuracy of observation that continued and that never quite said what it was saying. You were present in her world, and you were outside something that had previously been available to you. Loss was precise and permanent and expressed with perfect warmth from behind the closed door of it. One lady-in-waiting, speaking years later to a biographer whose account has circulated in the community of people who write about the royal family, described learning the distinction between Mary's genuine warmth and her performed warmth. Genuine warmth was real and was warm, and it made you feel that you were specifically seen and specifically valued. Performed warmth was indistinguishable to outsiders, and was only recognizable to people who had been inside the genuine version and could feel when the genuine version was removed, exactly what was replaced it. performed warmth was accurate and consistent, and entirely without the dimension that had previously been there. Lady-in-Waiting described the experience of discovering that she had been moved from the genuine category to the performed category as one of more disorienting experiences of her professional life. The domestic staff in Mary's various households operated under a regime of standards that consistent and demanding in the way that only households managed by people who believe deeply in correct execution of tasks can manage to be. Every surface was required to be correct. Every placement was required to be correct. Objects that she had collected and arranged were to remain in their arranged positions unless she specifically directed otherwise. Footmen who moved a piece without authorization discovered that the discovery would be made quietly and that the discovery would be noted. She was not, by the accounts available, cruel to the domestic staff in the way of actively unkind employers. She did not raise her voice at them, did not humiliate them publicly. She did not use her authority in the direct abusive way of someone who confuses power with license. What she did was maintain a standard of execution that required perfect performance from people who were human, and who therefore sometimes failed to achieve it, and whose failures were catalogued with the same precision she applied to everything else. Footman, who had been in her service for 30 years, and who was described in one account as having never in 3 decades told that he had done something well, was not an unusual experience in her household. Acknowledgement that a task had been performed correctly was, in her understanding, the standard expectation. Done what you were required to do. The acknowledgement of correctness was implied in the absence of correction. If she was not correcting you, you were performing correctly. The logic was consistent with everything else about her. It was also human beings who functioned better in the presence of explicit acknowledgement than in the presence of its mere absence, not sufficient. Mary spent the winter of 1952 and 1953 in Marlborough House, under conditions that combined the normal limitations of very old age with the specific complication of a woman who was constitutionally opposed to acknowledging limitation of any kind. She was 85. She had cancer, diagnosed in the summer of 1952. She had been in generally robust physical health for her age throughout her 70s and early 80s. Cancer's arrival in her life was treated by her as an inconvenience to be managed rather than a condition to be accommodated. Did not discuss the cancer publicly. She continued making appearances. She attended the exhibition of coronation regalia at the Victoria and Albert Museum in March 1953, which was exactly the kind of visit she had been making all her life. A queen interested in the objects connected to her institution, showing up to see them properly displayed in the company of people who arrange the visit with the care of people, managing someone who is more fragile than they appear. She had, in the months following George VI's death in February 1952, organized several important transfers. She gave her granddaughter, the new queen, various significant pieces from her personal collection. She gave directions about the disposition of objects at Marlborough House. She was conducting deliberate and unhurried way of a woman who understood that the transfer of things required as much attention as the acquisition of them. Process of ensuring that what she had built would continue in the custody she had arranged for it. She also wrote letters in the last winter of her life that were noted, by those who received them, warmer in register than her correspondence usually achieved. Whether this was a function of the awareness of approaching death, easing of the urgency that had always characterized her active management of everything around her, simply of the different perspective that comes at the end of a very long life, is not possible to establish. The letters were warmer. People who received them preserved that observation. She had wanted above any other remaining ambition to see Elizabeth crowned. She had lived through enough to understand what a coronation meant. The formal transfer of the institution's weight onto the next generation, ceremony that made it official, in the way that the actual death and succession did not quite manage to make it official. She had worn the crown in the Abbey in 1911. She had attended the coronation of her son in 1937, sitting in the stalls and watching Bertie carry the weight she had watched accumulate since December 1936. She had been planning to attend the ceremony of June 1953, and had arranged her schedule with the expectation of being present. Illness moved faster than the schedule permitted. On March 24, 1953, Queen Mary died at Marlborough House. In the house she had occupied for 17 years, surrounded by the household she had maintained, and the objects she had collected, and the life she built from the components available to her since the beginning: correctness, discipline, organization, the refusal to be moved by anything that might compromise the performance of the role. She was 85 years old. Coronation was 10 weeks away. Her instructions had been clear: no mourning delay. The country had been waiting. The new queen had been prepared. Ceremony should proceed as planned. Her funeral was held on March 30, 1953, at St. George's Chapel, Windsor. Duke of Windsor had flown from France. He was present, correct, performing the function of a son at his mother's funeral, with the composure that occasion required. Wallace was in France. The people who had denied Wallace the title, across 17 years, thereby also prevented a widow from attending her husband's mother's funeral, without being declared implicitly an intrusion. 12 words spoken or recorded in the hours after the funeral are the most famous thing Edward ever said about his mother. They have been treated as the verdict, the icy fluid, but 12 words cannot hold the full assessment of 85 years and the relationship contained in them, and the inadequacy of 12 words for such a task is itself part of the story. He had been trying to speak to her, in one form or another, for 50 years, and the forms kept failing him. In the end, he gave her 12 words from outside the chapel and went back to France. The coronation was held on June 2, 1953. Photographs show Elizabeth II in Westminster Abbey, in the ancient chair, in the ancient dress, with the ancient crown on her head, surrounded by the ancient ceremony that her grandmother had spent a lifetime maintaining, and her parents had spent their lives serving. Television cameras were there for the first time in the Abbey's history for a coronation, broadcasting to millions of homes across Britain and the Commonwealth. Mary R. had catalogued the objects in that ceremony. She had advised on its arrangements. She had prepared the person now wearing the crown by giving her regular visits to Marlborough House in the previous decade, the knowledge of the institution that only someone who had lived inside it for 60 years could transmit. The empty seat where she might have been was one of the facts of that day. One of many facts of that day, and was not the most important one. The ceremony proceeded correctly, as arranged. Royal collection at the time of Mary's death in March 1953 contained thousands of objects that she had identified, acquired, catalogued, placed. The range of these objects was extraordinary in its scope. English furniture from the 18th century, Italian paintings from the Renaissance, Fabergé eggs and objets d'art given as gifts by the Russian imperial family, Indian jewels from the Delhi Durbar, miniature portraits of every branch of the extended royal family dating from the 16th century forward, European porcelain, Chinese ceramics, Japanese lacquer, silver, tapestries, drawings. She had also built what she described as a museum of family mementos at Marlborough House, collection of objects connected to specific people and events in royal history. A ring that had belonged to a queen 2 centuries before, piece of furniture from a particular residence, a personal object from a specific ancestor. He catalogued these with the thoroughness of a working archivist, noting provenance, connecting each object to the person associated with it, building a material record of royal history across time. This was not decorative work, it was serious work, and it was work that would not have been done had she not done it. The knowledge she brought to it was not easily acquired and was not possessed by other people in the household in comparable depth. She was in this domain genuinely expert. Collection is materially richer for her lifetime of attention to it. She also had favorites among the objects she collected. Favorites tell something about her. She particularly loved miniature portraits, small, precise, portable images of people who had been painted for someone who wanted to carry them. Intimacy of a miniature portrait is a specific kind of intimacy, different from a large formal canvas, closer to a letter than to a monument. The person who painted it, the person who ordered it, the person it was made for, are all implied in the scale. May had grown up in rooms where the miniatures were part of the decoration, and had absorbed from them something about the relationship between an image and the person depicted. She also loved objects with confirmed royal provenance. Things that had touched specific people at specific moments, a glove from a particular ceremony, a fan from a particular evening, objects whose connection to a real person and a real moment could be documented. She liked the documentary function of things, fact that the right object could prove the story rather than merely illustrate it. This is, in retrospect, clearest expression of what collecting meant to her. She had grown up in a household whose claim to royal status was real but imperfect. Connection to the center of the institution was genuine but not solid, whose position could be questioned. She had spent her adult life building something that could not be questioned because the evidence was there, catalogued and marked and placed in the rooms where it belonged. Mary, I was here. This is mine. This is where it belongs. Psychological reality underneath the collecting is not complicated once you see it. The little girl in the borrowed house, watching her mother spend money that didn't exist, learning that comfort could vanish, grown into a queen who made sure that nothing she valued would vanish because she had documented its location and her claim to it. Documentation was real, the claim was real, the method of acquiring some of it was less defensible than the claim. What she could not collect, organize and mark was the love of the people closest to her. You cannot put initials on a feeling, cannot catalogue a relationship in a way that makes it permanent. You cannot arrange a person the way you arrange a chair. People in her life moved, responded, reacted, left, died, and none of it could be prevented by the application of enough organization, documentation, and correct placement. This is the thing she could not do, the thing the collection could not solve. When Elizabeth II died in September 2022, at Balmoral, aged 96, she had reigned for 70 years. She had been prepared for the role in no small part by the grandmother who died 10 weeks before her coronation and who had given her cross visits to Marlborough House in the previous decade, the accumulated practical knowledge of a woman who had been inside the institution since 1883. The preparation was real and it mattered. The institution that Elizabeth II maintained across 70 years of the most significant period of change in its modern history, including the decolonization of the empire, the transformation of Britain's global position, social changes of the 60s and 70s and 80s that challenged every established institution, the Diana crisis of 1997, sustained pressure of an increasingly scrutinizing media and public, maintained in large part through the same combination of discipline and correct performance and institutional prioritization over personal feeling that Mary had practiced and transmitted. Whether this is a good thing is a question that depends entirely on what you believe the institution for and what you believe it costs the people inside it. The argument for the institution, stated in its most straightforward terms, a stable constitutional monarchy is a genuine political good. It provides continuity, absorbs the symbolic content of national identity in ways that allow the political system to function without that content distorting the politics, gives a country something to gather around in moments of collective crisis without that gathering being partisan. Argument is coherent and defensible. It does not require the institution to be perfect to be valid. Argument against what Mary built is also coherent and defensible. It is the argument that the price paid by the people inside the institution, David in 50 Years of Exile, and by Bertie in The Stammer and the Early Death, and by Princess Mary in The Cold Marriage, and by Prince John in The Cottage, and by George of Kent in the managed silence around who he was a human price paid by human beings who deserved something the institution, constitutionally incapable of providing, recognition of the personal reality of being a person rather than a position. Mary herself, if she had been capable of hearing and engaging with this argument, would have pointed to the counterexample. She had been a person as well as a position. She had experienced the specific personal difficulty of growing up in a household that could not sustain life it was performing, of being exiled by debt to a foreign country at 16, being engaged to a prince who died and transferred to his brother with the efficiency of an institutional transaction. She had managed all of this by becoming exactly what the institution required. She had not asked the institution to accommodate her personal reality. She had accommodated the institution. The question she would not have been able to hear was, what if the accommodation was too costly? If the discipline that preserved the institution also prevented the formation of the people required to serve in it from developing in the ways would have made both them and the institution more capable of the things institutions are supposed to do. George VI was a better king than his early years predicted, not because of what his formation had given him, but because of what he had built. Against it, his formation had produced a man who stammered and was anxious and who was frightened of his father, man who stood in the bombed streets of London in the autumn of 1940 and returned to Buckingham Palace the next morning had built himself into capacity from the damaged materials his childhood had supplied. The institution benefited from that. The benefit came in spite of the formation, not because of it. Mary could not see this. She had been formed in a specific way and had concluded, based on the evidence of her own life, that the formation produced what was required. She had been required to be queen, and she had been queen. thoroughness, and a duration that no one who watched her could reasonably dispute. The conclusion she drew from this, which she applied to the 6 children she raised and to the institution she served, was that the method worked. Method did produce certain outcomes. It produced the royal collection, produced the visible maintenance of the monarchy's form through 2 world wars and the end of empire. It produced Elizabeth II. Also produced the Duke of Windsor in exile. It produced a man who died at 56, produced a daughter in a cold marriage and a son in a cottage, and another son whose death was recorded as a relief. The accounting is not simple. Counting never is with people of this kind, because what they build is real and what they cost is also real. 2 things exist simultaneously, without resolving into a verdict that covers both. She was petty in her punishments, perfectly composed in her endurance. She was vicious in the specific and quiet ways available to someone of her position and character. She was also, in ways that the simple verdict cannot hold, someone who understood something true about what it takes to build something that lasts and who paid the personal cost of building it, and who passed that cost on to everyone who came after her. That was worth it depends on how much you value what she built. It depends on what you think institutions are for. And it depends on whether you think the 6 children who grew up in her household would have chosen, if they had been asked, pay the price they paid for the institution she gave the rest of her life to maintaining. They were not asked. Queen Mary had self-knowledge about the kind of person she was, is a question that the biographical record does not answer directly. Absence is itself significant. The people who have written about her most carefully, from James Pope Hennessy in the authorized biography of 1959 to the later scholars who have drawn on wider sources, tend to note a consistent pattern. She understood herself as a person who did what was required. She understood herself as a servant of the institution. She understood herself as someone who had been correctly formed and who performed correctly and whose management of the people around her was in service of the standard rather than in service of any personal agenda. What she did not appear to understand, the record consistently fails to find evidence of her having understood, was the cost that her management imposed. She had been managed herself, in childhood, in ways that produced her. She had responded to that management by deciding that the management was correct. She had then applied a version of the management to the people around her. The cycle was complete and self-reinforcing. The thing that breaks cycles of this kind is usually one of 2 forces: external shock, or a moment of genuine self-reflection that requires, its precondition, the willingness to question the management's correctness. She was not given the external shock in any form that was adequately targeted at the specific area where the self-reflection was needed. George's death, the abdication, the deaths of her sons, the exile of David, each of these was a form of loss that might have produced different personality, a reconsideration. They did not produce it in her. She recorded them in the careful diary language that was the only form available to her, managed the correct response to each of them, and continued. Willingness to question the management's correctness was something she was constitutionally opposed to, because the management's correctness was the foundation of everything she had built. If the method was wrong, everything built on it was built on something wrong. She could not hold that thought and continue to be who she was, so she did not hold it. She maintained the method and she continued. Pope Hennessy, who spent years researching the authorized biography and who interviewed many people who known her, wrote in private letters to friends during the research process that he found her, as a biographical subject, extraordinary and somewhat terrifying. Extraordinary in the consistency and thoroughness of her self-construction, terrifying in the sense that the construction had been so complete that there was very little access to the person underneath it. He found evidence of warmth in her correspondence, in the letters with her ladies-in-waiting, private notes that she wrote to people she trusted. He found a genuine person in the private record. He also found that the genuine person had been managed by herself for 80 years in the same way she managed everything. Authorized biography, when it was published in 1959, was admiring in tone and careful in its selection of material, which was appropriate for an authorized biography, and which produced a portrait that later biographers found useful as a primary source and incomplete as a full account. The material Pope Hennessy had gathered that did not make it into the published book was available to later scholars, produced a more complex picture than the published version had presented. The more complex picture shows is a woman who was more capable of warmth in private than the public record suggested, and who was also, ways that mattered most to the people closest to her, as cold as the public record implies. Both things were true simultaneously. Warmth was real, and the coldness was real, and neither cancelled the other. Management of which one appeared in which context was the work she had been doing all her life. Diaries that Queen Mary kept across her adult life, from the early years of her marriage through to the final entries before her death, constitute one of the most extensively consulted and least revealing sources in British royal history. This is itself significant. She began keeping a diary as a young woman and maintained the practice for decades. Volumes are preserved and have been consulted by every serious biographer of the period. What they contain is a record of public events attended, duties performed, places visited, weather noted, people received, objects acquired. Prose is precise and controlled, and almost entirely free of the kind of interior self-examination that would allow a reader to understand what writer was feeling while she was writing it. This is not unusual for diaries of her class and period. Private diary in Victorian and Edwardian aristocratic practice was not a confessional form. It was closer to a log, a record of what occurred, tamed with regularity and completeness, available for consultation when the question of what had happened on a particular day needed to be settled. The emotional content that later generations have come to expect from a diary, the unguarded observation, the honest account of feeling, self-questioning, was not what a woman of her formation understood the diary to be for. There are exceptions. Exceptions are revealing precisely because they are exceptions. The entry on George V's death is gone. 3 words. Entry on Prince John's death. A great shock, though for the poor little boy's restless soul, death came as a great relief. Entries from the abdication crisis, which several biographers have described as unusually expressive for their context. She wrote that she did not remember ever having felt such a shock in her life. Each of these exceptions occurs at a moment of crisis too large to be reduced to the record of events format that served her under ordinary conditions. The event was too significant to be logged as an attendance or a receipt, so the format breaks briefly. Something that is closer to personal feeling enters the prose before the composure reasserts itself, and the next entry returns to the ordinary chord. What this tells us is not that she had no feelings. It tells us that the feelings were present and real, and that she was capable of registering them in the diary when they were large enough to force their way through the formal container. Also tells us that the formal container was the dominant form, and that under ordinary conditions, conditions under which a different person might have written at length about what they noticed, what they wanted, what they feared, they regretted, she wrote down what happened and moved to the next entry. The diaries were also, by the accounts of those who were close to her, entirely private in the usual sense. She understood that they would be read. She understood that the authorized biography would draw on them. She had managed her public presentation for 60 years, and the diary was a form of public presentation. However formal its audience and however delayed the presentation, the control was consistent. Pope Hennessy, the biographer, found in the private letters she exchanged with her ladies in waiting, and with the small number of people she genuinely trusted, something that the diaries did not contain: warmth, humor, self-awareness, the capacity for genuine observation of the people around her that suggested she understood better than she allowed the official record to suggest. Those letters are the best evidence available that there was a private person behind the institutional performance, and that the private person was more complicated and more feeling than the public record permits. Those letters are also more carefully managed than the impression of private warmth might suggest. She wrote to people she trusted. She managed what she revealed even to them. The warmth was real and it was also curated. The two things are not contradictions, the result of a formation that had placed management above expression for so long that the management was itself a form of intimacy. People she trusted were the people she allowed to see her manage, and seeing someone manage with skill and humanity is its own form of closeness. She had been managing since Florence. The management was the person. What was underneath it, if there was an underneath to find, she kept there. 3 specific moments in the historical record of Queen Mary carry in their particular detail the full weight of what kind of person she was. First is the story of the antique dealer's locked rooms. A dealer in London antiques, interviewed by a journalist in the years after Mary's death, and quoted in a profile published in a Sunday newspaper, described the practice that had been standard in his trade during her active years of collecting. When word came that the Queen was going to visit, best pieces went into the back room. Not all of them, because the best pieces were sometimes the ones she came specifically to see. Completely emptied showroom would have been insulting. The dealers learned to leave enough to satisfy her attention without leaving the pieces most wanted to keep. The ones they left were sometimes the ones they could bear to lose. He described one occasion when a colleague had failed to secure a particular piece before her arrival, small Chinese jade figure of the 18th century, and had watched the Queen admire it, heard her note how well it would sit alongside something she already owned, and had then watched the piece leave in the royal car. He described his colleague's expression during this process as one he found difficult to characterize, not angry. Anger was not the appropriate response to a queen removing your inventory, but also not resigned, because resignation suggests a peace with the situation that had not been achieved. It was, he said, expression of a man who had understood something new about what the word admiration could mean. The second moment is from the spring of 1952. Mary was 84 years old and had recently lost her second son. She had been visited at Marlborough House by a younger member of the family. The account that was preserved in correspondence describes her asking, during the visit, the placement of a particular piece of Chinese porcelain in one of the rooms at Windsor. She had made a note, apparently, at some point in the previous years, that the piece was not being correctly displayed. It was placed on the wrong surface, in a light that did not suit it, in a position relative to the other pieces in the room that violated the organizational logic she had applied when she arranged those rooms. She wanted to know whether her suggestion for its correct placement had been implemented. She was 84. She had lost her husband 16 years before and her son 6 weeks before. She was asking about the placement of a Chinese porcelain figure. Accounts of this moment, recorded by the person who was present at the visit, and who preserved it in correspondence, treat it as simultaneously touching and characteristic. Touching because it represented the continuation of a lifelong engagement that had been genuinely important to her, and characteristic because it represented the prioritization of the object's correct placement over every other thing might otherwise have been on her mind. She was right about the porcelain. The piece was subsequently moved. Third moment is from the winter of 1918, 6 weeks before Prince John's death. John had spent Christmas Day with the family at Sandringham House. As he did every year, he was brought from Wood Farm for the day and returned to Wood Farm in the evening. Christmas gathering at Sandringham was the main family assembly of the year, occasion when the household came together, in the way that households manage when their members are scattered, and the ceremonies of the season acquire them in the same place. John came to the gathering. He sat at the table. He was 13 years old, epileptic, developmentally different, living in a separate household with a nurse who loved him. He ate Christmas dinner with his family. His brothers were around him. Parents were at the head of the table. Then he was driven back to Wood Farm. The drive would have taken a few minutes. Family would have remained at Sandringham House for the evening. John would have arrived at Wood Farm in the winter dark and been received by Lala, who was his world in the practical sense, and who would have managed the transition from the family gathering to the smaller world he actually in. 6 weeks later he was dead. His mother was at Buckingham Palace when the telephone call came. She and George drove to Wood Farm. She recorded the shock. She recorded the relief. She recorded that little Johnny had looked very peaceful lying there. 3 moments are different in scale and in kind. They are connected by the same quality. The alignment in each of them, Queen's attention, with the things that she had decided mattered, in a way that makes the gap between where her attention was and where other people might have expected it to be not a mystery but a consistent, observable characteristic. She decided what mattered. She attended to it thoroughly. The gap between her attention and other people's expectations of it was the person. It is a particular type of person whose greatest virtue and most consequential failing are the same quality. The virtue in Mary's case, consistency. She was consistent across 85 years in a way that almost no one who has ever occupied her position has managed to replicate. She was consistent in her discipline, in her performance of duty, in her management of the household's public presentation, in her refusal to let any personal feeling override the institutional requirement. She showed up, she was prepared, she was correct. Failing was also consistency. She applied the same standards to her children that she applied to herself. out the adjustment that a parent who observes individual children carefully learns to make. She had been formed in one way and had concluded that the formation was correct. And she administered the same formation to 6 different people who required 6 different things from their parents and from the world. And she administered it with the thoroughness that characterized everything she did. Question the historical record cannot answer is whether she knew this, whether there were moments, privacy of the diary that records so little of its writer's interior, when she looked at what she had built and what the building had cost and asked herself, silence that follows the departure of the last guest from the room that has been correctly managed for 50 years, whether it had been worth it, whether the institution she had preserved had been worth the people she had shaped to fit its requirements. Diary gives no answer. The diary records what happened. She attended, she received, she organized, she managed, she arranged. She noted the objects that needed attention, and the events that required presence, and the duties that fell due at the stated intervals. She noted days when the feeling broke through the form, that she was shocked, or that she missed him, or that it had come as a great relief. Rest is the record of a woman performing her life with the thoroughness that her formation had produced, leaving the interior of that performance to the privacy she had maintained since Florence. What remains is the institution and the collection, 6 children's trajectories, and the question she was too deeply inside to ask herself clearly. History asks it on her behalf, in judgment which is too simple, but in the effort to understand how a person becomes so completely the servant of the role they inhabit, that role and the person become indistinguishable to everyone, including the person performing it. She was that person. She had made herself that person, and she had done it so thoroughly and for so long that by the time anyone thought to ask what lay underneath, answer and the asking were the same. There is a photograph taken at the Delhi Durbar in 1911 that captures her in a single image more completely. Portraits and the public records together manage. She is on the dais, in the full imperial regalia, in the winter light of a December morning on the plain outside Delhi, with the assembled representatives of the empire below her and George beside her and the weight of the institution on her, in the literal sense of the jewels and the crown and the ermine and the silk. She is entirely still. She is entirely composed. She is exactly where the institution requires her to be, dressed exactly as it requires, positioned exactly as it requires, performing exactly what is required with a thoroughness that is, looked at with the right kind of attention, one of the most complete acts of human self-organization that the century produced. Whether she was happy is not the question the photograph poses. Photograph poses a different question. Whether she knew the difference between the performance and the person performing it, and whether, the end of 85 years of that performance, the difference had ceased to be something she was capable of perceiving. Exactly like the Queen. She had always looked exactly like the Queen. She had made herself exactly the Queen. Queen Mary died on March 24, 1853 at Marlborough House. The cancer diagnosis had been made the previous summer. She had maintained her engagement with the world that interested her with a persistence that struck the people around her as characteristic to point of being remarkable. She had known about the diagnosis, and she had continued. She had attended to the matters that required her attention. She had continued taking an interest in the arrangements for the coronation. She had given explicit instructions that her death was not to be allowed to delay the coronation scheduled for June 2, 1953. Instruction was an act of institutional will of a piece with everything she had done for 60 years. The institution's requirements came first. Ceremony had been planned and announced, and the country had organized itself around it, and there was no personal grief, her own death included, justified undoing the organizing. She died 10 weeks before the ceremony. The funeral was held on March 31 at Windsor, at St. George's Chapel. Procession through the streets of London brought out the crowds in the manner of all royal funerals. Public gathering for the occasion that constituted their participation in the institution's management of its own history. The coffin was carried. Family walked behind it. The Duke of Windsor flew in from France. He had not seen his mother alive for many years. He had attended the various family occasions that death creates, when families that have been estranged must stand in the same room for the same reason, and his presence at the funeral was the last such occasion and the most formal. He wore his uniform. He walked behind the coffin. He stood at the graveside. His 12-word assessment of the moment, made in conversation with a friend shortly afterward, and preserved in that friends' account and subsequently quoted in enough biographies to have become part of the permanent record was, "She had always been as icy cold in death as she was in life." This sentence is unfair in the way grief becomes unfair after long years of compression. He was not wrong about the coldness. What he was wrong about was the meaning he assigned it. The coldness was not the absence of love. It was the absence of the capacity to express love in the ways he had needed it to be expressed, which is a different thing. Two things are not distinguishable from inside the need, but the distinction exists. He returned to France. He lived at the Boulevard Suchet house in Paris with Wallace for the remaining 19 years of his life. His death in May 1972 brought his niece to his bedside in one of the few moments when the wall between the institution and the person it had contained came briefly down. She was there. He died 10 days later. He was buried at Frogmore in the grounds at Windsor, near the graves of his mother and father, and the grandmother he had known as a child. The coronation proceeded as Mary had instructed it should. June 2nd, 1953, the crowds gathered in London in the rain, which was the particular meteorological gift of an English summer, to a ceremony that required outdoor participation. 27 million people in Britain watched on television. This was the first coronation to be televised, had been argued over extensively in the months preceding it, and which was finally permitted over the objection of some members of the establishment who thought the ceremony too sacred to be viewed in sitting rooms. Mary, had she been alive, probably have had an opinion about this. The opinion is not available. Elizabeth II received at her coronation was an institution that her grandmother had spent 60 years maintaining in a form adequate to be inherited. The royal collection was organized and catalogued and preserved. The protocols were in place. Household had been managed across 2 world wars and the end of empire and the abdication and the deaths of children and the long widowhood and war years at Badminton with 55 servants and stripped ivory in the walls. Institutional knowledge that Elizabeth received had been transmitted in the only way that practical institutional knowledge can be transmitted, through proximity and observation over time. Elizabeth had visited her grandmother at Marlborough House through the 1940s and into the early 1950s. What those visits had provided was not a formal education in the requirements of the role, but something more durable than formal education. Accumulated impression of a woman who had inhabited the role at full depth for 6 decades, and who understood its requirements from the inside of having met them day after day across all the circumstances that the role had produced. Elizabeth had also received her grandmother's jewels. Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara, given to Mary at her wedding in 1893, passed to Elizabeth at her wedding in 1947. The necklaces, brooches, the Indian pieces from the Delhi Durbar, the Russian pieces from the networks of royal cousins who had not survived their century, passed from one generation to the next with the continuity that objects maintain better than people. The collection is still there. Objects are still in their correct positions. The catalogue still carries the royal collection's marking. The tiara appears on the currency. Institution continues. Whether this is the right measure of a life is the question that biographies of people like Mary tend to arrive at, and unanswered, because the question cannot be answered without first answering a more fundamental one. What is a life for? If a life is for the maintenance and transmission of institutions that outlast it, then Mary's life was well spent, and the accounting is favorable. Life is for the cultivation of the individual person within it, for the development of warmth and connection, and the full inhabitation of one's own interior. Then the accounting is different, and the balance is different, and the 6 children who grew up in her household have a different weight. In the sum, she did not leave an account of which she believed. She left the collection and the institution and the thin, careful diary entries in which grief was managed into resolution and complexity was organized into correctness. And she left the question open. May have been the most honest thing she did. That is the story of Queen Mary of Teck. Petty in the ways she punished, calculating in the way she built, and perfectly vicious in the specific, quiet, sustained way that only the very controlled can manage. Documentary gave you something new. Please subscribe to the channel and tap the notification bell so you never miss a new release. Like means the algorithm shows this to more people who would find it worth their time. Leave a comment below. Was Queen Mary a product of her age? Something worse? We read every comment. Thank you for staying with us to the end. The next documentary is already in production.